Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into two disturbing true stories from the Appalachian Mountains. Both are powerful reminders that some people out there are truly evil, and when the opportunity comes, they don't hesitate to do harm. The second story especially gave me goosebumps. Even though it happened years ago, it's a haunting example of how you can think you know someone, only to realize they were a true monster all along. I was completely drawn into these stories, and I hope you find them just as gripping as I did when I first read and put them together for this video. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And now, let's get into it. Remember, viewer discretion is advised. Let me be honest right from the start and tell you that I'm no natural storyteller, and I don't have the gift for writing like some people do. But I'll do my best to clearly share what happened to me just 2 weeks ago at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. In a place so remote the silence feels almost heavy. This part of the Appalachian Mountains, especially on the far western edge, is way more isolated than any photo could ever show or any tourist brochure could possibly describe. It's completely surrounded by thick, dense forests, the kind where the dark green turns nearly black at dusk. And outside of tourist season, which, by the way, only starts about a month after the time I went, the isolation is so deep, you can practically hear the trees breathe, like they're the only ones witnessing whatever goes on there. It all started the way stories like this usually do. Everything was going great, smooth, with that kind of excitement that comes when you're escaping the city to dive into nature. The only thing that, looking back now, made me a little uneasy was something I didn't even think twice about at the time. But now I see it differently. Before I began my hike, I parked my car at one of the northernmost trailheads. I knew the area well and was aware that even the more popular entry points are rarely crowded, especially off-season. So it struck me as odd when I saw a pickup truck already parked there. That alone didn't mean much. Could have been another early hiker, or just someone passing through. What really got under my skin was the man sitting inside. He was alone, calmly smoking, with an expression I can't quite put into words. I started getting my backpack ready, arranging the stuff I'd bought at Walmart before the trip, trying to make room for everything, and I realized I could feel his eyes on me. Not just casual curiosity. This was deeper, more fixed, more unsettling. We've all felt it before. That kind of stare that's not just visual, but almost physical. Like a cold hand settling on the back of your neck. That's exactly how it felt, and I knew something about it wasn't right. I was almost done organizing my pack when the man got out of the truck and started walking toward me. Slowly, but with purpose. His face showed the strange, unreadable expression. He asked me, in a lazy drawl, if I needed help with anything, and if I was planning to hike the trail. I forced a smile, trying to look relaxed, and told him everything was fine and that I was meeting up with a group of friends who were already inside the forest. That was a lie, of course, but in that moment, my instincts screamed at me to lie. He nodded, and slowly walked back to the truck. For a few seconds, I seriously thought about getting back in my car, starting it up, and finding another trailhead, even if that meant a major detour. But then I started rationalizing. I was clearly overreacting, jumping to conclusions. Maybe the guy was just weird, and weird doesn't necessarily mean dangerous. Besides, I trusted my physical ability. I was bigger than him, and I didn't have any concrete reason to panic. So I ignored the unease and set off on the trail. By the second day of hiking, I was happy to have reached the lake. Deep Creek Lake really is beautiful. And at that time of year, the peacefulness feels almost unreal. I wasn't even thinking about the guy in the pickup anymore. I pitched my tent a little back from the shoreline, not too close, not too far, and took the chance to relax, breathe deep, and let the quiet of the forest settle me. I have a habit on these trips. I always bring a mini emergency bag. Might sound paranoid, but 1, I kind of am, and 2, I've heard too many stories gone wrong, and I always prefer to be safe. In that bag, I carry my handgun, a sharp knife, a water filter, some energy bars, a crank flashlight, essential meds, and most importantly, a satellite communication device with an SOS button. I've never had to use it, but just knowing it's there always brings me peace of mind. And thank God I brought it this time. It was past 9 p.m. when I first heard footsteps in the distance. I stood up immediately, fully alert, every sense on edge. In that area, running into someone is highly unlikely. Not impossible, but very unlikely. It could have been an animal, a bear maybe. The footsteps stopped, and after a while, I returned to the fire I was setting up, mostly for psychological comfort rather than real need. By 11:30 p.m., with the forest swallowed in a darkness so thick that the moon seemed to hesitate before shining through, I decided to call it a night. I climbed into the tent, zipped it up carefully, and got ready to sleep. But as soon as I lay down, I heard the footsteps. And this time, they were much closer. The silence that followed was crushing. I froze completely, heart pounding so hard it hurt my chest, and slowly reached out to grab the small backpack where I kept my gun. That feeling of being utterly vulnerable, alone in the middle of nowhere, in absolute darkness, knowing someone or something was getting closer to the tent. That's a fear I can't quite describe. It's raw, primal, paralyzing. Time seemed frozen. Every second stretched into eternity. I felt steps circling the tent. Then something brushing against the fabric, dragging across it. The faint moonlight filtering through the trees and the tent material revealed vague shapes, but enough to see something metallic sliding along it. And then I knew. Don't ask me how. I just knew. It was a gun. A gun scraping along the fabric of my tent. What happened next was fast, chaotic, and unreal. A shot shattered the silence, tearing through the fabric and the air at the same time. I felt the impact like it had hit me directly. The brutal rip of the tent was deafening, and for a moment, I couldn't even tell if I'd been hit or not. My body surged with adrenaline. I fired back without thinking. Just pure reaction. I had the advantage of seeing the man's outline, and I know I hit him. He stumbled back with a muffled grunt. That split second gave me the time I needed. I ripped open the tent, grabbed my emergency bag, and ran. I ran like I've never run before, through the trees, tripping over roots, scratched by branches. My heart threatening to explode from my chest. But I didn't stop. The fear was gone. All that was left was instinct, and I knew I was ready to do whatever it took to get out alive. I didn't stop until I felt like I was far enough, maybe safe. The first thing I did was check myself to see if I'd been hit. I hadn't. I sighed with relief, pulled out the emergency beacon, activated the SOS, and waited. When the rescue team arrived, it was nearly dawn. They were incredible, professional, and compassionate. I told them everything, from the truck, to the man, to the shooting. I couldn't be 100% sure it was the same guy, but my gut told me it was. An investigation was opened, and here's what I know so far. The pickup was still parked there, empty. Turns out it had been reported stolen 3 months earlier. My tent was found in shreds, like someone had lost their mind after I'd already fled. I saw photos, and it looked like a full-on crime scene, like I'd died inside. There was a pool of blood near the entrance, and the tent was splattered with it. I also know that despite losing a lot of blood, the guys survived. And now, after what happened, I understand that the real danger in these mountains doesn't come from wild animals or old legends about ghosts and forest creatures. The real danger wears human skin. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the most terrifying sound you can hear in the middle of the night isn't a bear's roar or the crack of a dry branch. It's the cold, metallic click of a gun being cocked. What I'm about to share with you didn't happen to me, but to my grandfather. And it's a story that serves as a stark reminder for anyone who thinks they truly know their friends, neighbors, or acquaintances. The truth is, reality is often murkier and far more complex than we'd like to believe. Even when we think we've got someone figured out, there are always hidden layers, masked behaviors, and subtle warning signs that only the most observant will ever notice. This story took place 43 years ago, in an isolated and, at least back then, completely forgotten corner of the world. McDowell County, West Virginia. My grandparents had a small wooden cabin tucked deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, completely cut off from everything and everyone. It wasn't their main home, but they spent a lot of time there, especially my grandfather, who had always preferred the thick, quiet stillness of the forest over the constant noise of cities, or even the smaller towns nearby. That cabin, which belongs to me now, was always meticulously taken care of, far more so than their actual house. My grandfather treated it like a sacred space. Every board, every nail, every inch of that place seemed like it had been put there with the kind of care you'd only use if you were building something to last for generations. In fact, the cabin had been handed down to him from my great-grandfather. That particular summer, my grandfather had decided to do some renovations in the attic. It wasn't a big space, but he wanted to make better use of it. Between putting in insulation, patching up the walls, and reinforcing the roof, the work was proving to be a lot tougher and more time-consuming than he'd expected. My grandmother stayed behind in town to take care of my mom, who was still just a little kid at the time, and wasn't planning on joining him for another couple of weeks. So he was completely alone in that cabin. Now, anyone who knows these woods, and more importantly, anyone who respects them, understands that there are certain unwritten rules you follow without question. You don't wander through the trees after dark. You don't answer voices coming from the brush. You never enter dense thickets without knowing exactly how to get out. And above all, you never, ever go into the woods without some form of protection. My grandfather followed these rules like they were gospel, like a code of conduct. And I can tell you with full confidence that when I go up to that cabin nowadays, I follow them too, out of both respect and fear. Not that I go often. I live in the city, and that part of the country's always given me the chills. It takes a certain kind of person, someone a whole lot braver than me, to live out there. The night everything started, my grandfather had spent the whole day sealing up a hole in one of the attic walls. He'd tried using some kind of mortar that ended up being a bust, so he had to improvise, which dragged the work out well past sunset. Even though he was still fairly young back then, he'd always struggled with sleep. Chronic insomnia, vivid nightmares, messed up sleep cycles. So he was often exhausted during the day. That night, the exhaustion hit him so hard that he passed out on the couch. Didn't even eat dinner or take a shower. He just gave in to the weight in his body and let his eyes close, slipping into a kind of sleep that felt like both mental and physical shutdown. What really shook him the next morning was that he had completely forgotten to do his usual checks before bed. He didn't lock the front door, didn't secure the windows, didn't make sure the shutters were bolted tight. None of it. And despite being dead tired, it had been a restless night, filled with tangled dreams, strange noises, and disturbing images. He remembered clearly hearing a soft knocking at the window. An oddly polite but persistent tapping, like someone trying not to be noticed. He recalled looking toward the sound and seeing what he thought was a child. Its head was bloodied, twisted slightly, as if it were trying to peer inside the cabin. He woke up the next morning in a panic, convinced it had all just been another one of his recurring nightmares. But this one felt different. He could actually remember details, something that rarely happened. Usually he'd just wake up with a vague sense of dread, no memory of what he'd dreamed. Still shaken, he had a light breakfast, then stepped outside to get some air and stretch his legs. That's when he noticed something strange on the living room window. At first, it looked like just another smudge in the buildup of dirt. But as he got closer, he saw it was dried blood. Small marks, like someone had pressed their forehead or hands to the glass. The memory of the dream hit him like a slap. What if it hadn't been a dream at all? What if that kid had really been there? He didn't wait around to find out. He grabbed his rifle and decided to search the area. Back then, you didn't just call the cops over every little thing, especially not in remote places like that. Everybody knew bad stuff happened out there. Settling scores, illegal dealings, sometimes worse. People did unspeakable things in those hills. And because it was rare for law enforcement to get involved, folks learned to handle things on their own. It was about survival, instinct. He'd been in the woods for a while when he heard something off to his right. A crackling of branches, something moving. He ducked into the underbrush without thinking, pulled out his binoculars, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A large man, wearing a crude mask and holding a rifle straight out in front of him, like he was hunting something. For a moment, my grandfather thought maybe it was just a hunter. He even considered shouting to let the guy know he wasn't alone, to avoid an accident. But something in his gut told him to stay quiet. The mask, the posture, the way the guy held the weapon. It didn't feel right. This man wasn't out there for deer. So he followed him. Didn't know why, just couldn't turn back. Something about it was deeply wrong. That image of the kid wouldn't leave his mind, and more, he was starting to believe it hadn't been a dream. He moved slowly, carefully, always keeping the man in sight. He doesn't remember how long he followed him. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. Then, suddenly, the masked man stopped. He shifted, tensed up, and turned right toward my grandfather. His heart stopped. He thought he'd been spotted, thought he was about to get shot. But then he realized the man wasn't looking at him. He was staring at something moving low across the ground between them. There, in the brush, was a boy, barely moving, practically invisible. But if you looked closely, you could tell he was disoriented, trying to crawl away, too weak to run. Without hesitation, my grandfather raised his rifle and fired. Not to kill, but to stop the man. He hit him in the leg, just enough to bring him down. Then he ran for the kid. The boy bolted as soon as he saw him, running like hell through the trees, even though he clearly had nothing left in the tank. My grandfather chased after him, and caught up quickly. The kid was trembling like a leaf. His face was scratched up, his knees bloody, eyes wide with the kind of horror no child should ever have to carry. He was barefoot, his heels torn open from running over roots and rocks. His clothes were torn and stained with mud, leaves, and what looked like blood. My grandfather knelt down and gently grabbed his shoulders, like he was afraid even a soft touch might break him. He tried to calm him down, told him he was safe now, that nobody was going to hurt him. He tried to bolt again, but the exhaustion won. He collapsed into my grandfather's arms. He gave him water, wrapped him in a blanket he'd packed by instinct, and they sat there, the two of them, for what felt like hours. Finally, my grandfather felt the boy was calm enough to move. He told him he was just going to check on the man he'd shot, that he'd be gone for only a minute. The boy nodded barely. When he got back to the spot, the man was gone. No body, just a small pool of blood and drag marks. At first, he thought the guy had crawled off, but then he saw the footprints, 2 sets, side by side, leading back into the deeper woods. Someone had helped him. He rushed back and found the boy still there, curled up at the base of a tree. He brought him to the cabin, fired up the generator, heated up some canned soup, and got him fed. Later that night, once the boy had passed out from exhaustion, he hiked down the mountain to the sheriff's office. The boy was taken to the hospital. Eventually, it came out that he'd escaped from a place called Old Fort, a notorious home for troubled kids. But the trouble, as is often the case, wasn't with the kids. In towns like that, people always know more than they let on. And after the story spread, it didn't take long for folks to figure out who those 2 men were. Turns out, it was common knowledge that they were both off. They spent too much time in the woods. Nobody knew exactly what they did. After that night, they vanished. Gone. The cops raided their houses and came up empty. But behind the old garage where they worked, hidden in a trapdoor, they found 3 more masks. That's when my grandfather said his stomach turned and a cold kind of rage took over. One of those men, the one in the mask, was the same guy who had helped him change a flat tire just weeks earlier when his car got stuck in melting asphalt. The same guy who always offered him a cup of coffee when he stopped for gas. They'd even talked about going hunting together when the weather cooled down. Seemed nice, friendly, even funny. Not once had my grandfather suspected a thing. In the days that followed, the police searched the woods, combed through the village, checked every lead, but they never found either of the men. They vanished like smoke. No one's seen them since. Even their few relatives claimed to know nothing. They were never formally charged. There was no trial, no answers. But rumors started. People swore the police dug up bones on some abandoned property. Others said it was just small-town hysteria. The police, as always, told us next to nothing. My grandfather never spoke much about it again. He got quieter, which was saying something because he was already a man of few words. All he ever said was that he'd learned a hard lesson that night. The monsters don't hide in the shadows. They're right in front of us, smiling, waving, offering a helping hand when we need it. They have jobs, families, friends. And even when we think we're paying attention, even when we're sure we can see the signs, sometimes we don't see anything at all until it's too late. To this day, no one knows what really happened in those woods. The case was buried, and most folks have forgotten. The boy my grandfather saved was handed back over to the state, and my grandfather never heard a word about him again. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Spooky season is finally here, and I couldn't be more excited. This is hands down my favorite time of the year, and it always gives me that extra motivation to put these videos together. In this one, we're diving into 3 stories of people who ventured into the mountains and forests during this season, only to realize something was very, very wrong. From people stumbling onto something sinister inside remote cabins, to others being attacked by complete psychopaths, and finally, a group of teenagers who went camping in one of these isolated areas, and ended up being stalked by something they still can't explain, even 15 years later. If you've got any suggestions, make sure to drop them in the comments. And also, I've noticed some of you have been sharing where you're watching from, which has been super fun to see. So if you feel comfortable, let us know down below where in the world you're tuning in from. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened in 2017. At the time, we didn't tell anyone except friends, family, and the police. First, because we didn't really know what we had found, and then because we hadn't heard of other similar cases. But last night I was scrolling on Instagram and saw a reel of some girls who had rented an Airbnb or some cabin, and they had found something exactly like what we did. In that moment, I felt like I was back in that cabin again. As you can imagine, I didn't sleep, and I decided I would share this story. Maybe what we went through is more common than I realized at the time, and maybe it can help other people notice the signs and avoid serious problems. It was the first weekend of October when my girlfriend and I drove down to the Smoky Mountains. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that sharp chill that meant summer was finally over. I say finally because I hate summer. I hate the excessive heat and the feeling of constantly sweating. That's also why we always take our vacations around this time of year. We had rented this small cabin off a rental site, tucked way back off a dirt road that felt like it kept winding forever. We had the option of other cabins, but since we didn't have much experience being so isolated in the middle of the woods, at least this cabin allowed us to park the car right next to it. If something happened and we had to leave quickly, the car was right there. So when we finally pulled up, the place looked perfect. Wooden siding, a little front porch, no neighbors in sight, just the kind of quiet we thought we wanted. The cabin was in perfect condition, as if it had been renovated recently, which was obviously a plus. The first evening was peaceful. We unpacked, cooked a quick dinner, and turned in early. I've always slept well anywhere, even if it wasn't my own bed, so I expected the night to be peaceful too. But at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with this sudden jolt, like something had pulled me out of sleep. This is extremely rare for me, so I just lay there for a few seconds trying to understand why I had woken up so suddenly. The room was pitch black, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I felt this kind of chill, as if my body was reacting to something my mind couldn't process. I wish I could explain the sensation better, but that's the closest I can get to describing it. It felt like it was my body reacting, not my brain. I lay there listening, barely breathing, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the occasional creak of the old wood and the wind outside. Besides, it was ridiculous to think we weren't alone. The cabin was isolated, and all the doors and windows had been locked securely. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the kind of nerves that come with being in a new place, and drifted back to sleep. I had no intention of telling my wife anything. There was no reason to make her uncomfortable with something that was probably just in my head. But as soon as we woke up, I could tell she felt strange. She's always been more restless in her sleep, often has nightmares or insomnia. I figured she probably just hadn't slept well, and asked her what was wrong. She hesitated, clearly not wanting to ruin the trip, She just said it was nothing serious. She'd had a nightmare. I asked her what it was about, because I once read that people with too many nightmares sometimes need to talk about them to process them better. But what she said next drained every drop of blood from my body. She said she had dreamed that someone was there with us, watching us sleep. That she had woken up in the night and seen someone sitting in the chair in the room. She must have seen the panic on my face because she quickly stopped, gave a little laugh and said not to worry. It was just a nightmare. I just smiled back because I was incapable of saying anything. We had a chair in the corner of the room that had made me uncomfortable from the start. Why would there be a chair placed in the corner, pointed directly at the bed? And it wasn't even a comfortable reading chair, just a regular chair. I kept listening to her talk about our plans for the day, but I couldn't process anything beyond the feeling that us both sensing the same thing wasn't a coincidence. Still, I didn't want to ruin the trip. Didn't want to be dramatic or scare her when the only evidence I had that something was wrong was a feeling. So I tried to forget about it and enjoy the day. We went on a hike that ended up being really demanding. It had rained the day before, and the ground was muddy in some spots. That made us slower and more careful. Plus, we got lost, which added 2 more hours to the hike. By the time we got back to the cabin at the end of the day, we were both exhausted. We had slept badly the night before, and it had been a tough day. We just ate one of the snacks we had brought, locked all the doors and windows, and went to bed. I was so tired I didn't even have the energy to think about what had happened the night before. Luckily, that night I didn't wake up. My wife said the same thing. We were both so tired we just crashed. Since we'd had a good night's rest, I woke up in a better mood, glad I hadn't made a fuss the night before. It was probably just in my head anyway. But when I went to get something from the car, I discovered the front door was unlocked. Not just cracked open, but completely unlocked. Impossible. I was absolutely certain I had locked it. That was something we wouldn't have been careless about, especially not in the middle of nowhere and in a house that wasn't ours. I knew we had locked that door. I asked my wife if she had gotten up for some reason and gone outside. She said no, and that's when we both knew something was going on. She admitted she had also felt like it hadn't just been a dream, but she hadn't wanted to scare me. We sat down in the kitchen to talk while having breakfast. That's when she noticed something strange in the kitchen. Something neither of us had seen before. Right by the counter where the sink was, there was this thin, vertical crack. At first, it just looked like a split in the wood paneling. But when we looked closer, it was too straight. The line started near the floor and went all the way up to the ceiling. We pressed against it, and it gave just a little, like there was something behind it. With more effort, dragging it toward us as if it were a fixed piece of furniture, it shifted, and suddenly, we were staring at a narrow opening with a door. Inside, a set of steep wooden steps led down into darkness. We stood there frozen, trying to make sense of it. Finally, we took out our phone flashlights and pointed them down. At the bottom was a small, windowless room. In one corner lay a dirty old mattress. Next to it was a bucket. That was it. The sight was so simple, but it made my stomach drop. Whoever had been staying down there hadn't needed much. Just a place to sleep and a way to relieve themselves. And suddenly, the first night of feeling watched, all the little signs we had brushed off, they slammed together in my head. Someone had been living there. My wife hadn't just dreamed it, and I hadn't just imagined it. What we had felt was real. We shut the panel as fast as we could and didn't even talk about it. We both knew. Whatever had been going on in that cabin, we weren't about to stick around to find out if the person was coming back. We threw our stuff together, barely caring what we left behind, and were on the road in less than 10 minutes. The whole drive back, we talked about exactly what we had felt, what she had seen and thought was just a dream. Of course, we reported it to the owner. He gave us a refund without much fuss, which was a huge red flag that he didn't want trouble with us. He wanted to sweep it under the rug. I thought about leaving it there, but my wife said we couldn't let other people be tricked, so we called the police. Good thing we did. The owner wasn't convicted of anything, at least not that we know of. But the cabin stopped being rented. From time to time, I still check to see if it shows up on listings again, but I've never seen it since. I was 27 when this happened, about 2 years ago now. I'd been working remotely for a while and thought it would be nice to get out of town and rent a cabin somewhere quiet to write and decompress. I found this tiny listing on an obscure cabin rental site. A one-room hunting cabin at the edge of the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee. When I say obscure, I don't mean it in the way you're probably thinking. At the time I decided to rent the cabin, the site seemed normal to me. Sure, it was a bit rustic, but there was nothing major that worried me. The obscure part is something I only realized later, after everything that happened. The photos were beautiful, but grainy, and the description said, very secluded, 4 miles from nearest road access. That should have been a red flag for someone with zero survival skills in the forest, but at the time, it sounded perfect. I should say that when everything happened, I wasn't in the best mental state. And probably because of that, I made so many stupid decisions in a row. It was late October. The leaves were peak orange and red, and the air was crisp. I packed my laptop, some food, and a couple of books, and drove out there. Leaving my car at a small gravel pull-off and hiking the 4 miles in on a narrow, overgrown path. The cabin itself sat on a ridge called Spruce Ledge, surrounded by trees so dense you couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. No cell service at all, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive back down the mountain. Inside, the cabin was rustic but cozy. One main room with a wood stove, a cot, and a little kitchenette. There was an old creaky outhouse about 20 yards out back. It smelled of pine needles and cold earth, a smell that had always relaxed me and made me feel like I was part of something bigger. The first day went great. I had just arrived and my spirits were still high. I chopped some wood, lit the stove, and spent the evening reading. Around dusk, I went outside to take some photos of the sunset spilling over the hills. The woods were dead quiet, except for a few birds calling far off. Later, as it got dark, I thought I heard what sounded like something moving through the leaves way down the slope. I grabbed the camera I had brought with me, opened the window, and positioned myself to try to catch the best angle. But no matter how hard I looked at the trees, I couldn't see anything. At a certain point, the sound grew louder, and I could swear they were footsteps. I shut the window and stayed inside. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't going to be one of those people who immediately panicked just because someone else might be around. As long as I stayed inside the cabin and the person didn't come too close, everything would be fine. I threw another log on the fire and went back to my book. That night, lying on the couch, I could hear the wind rattling the branches. It was clearly going to be a turbulent night in the forest. The cabin walls were thin enough that every sound outside came through. At one point, maybe around 1 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of something metallic clinking. It wasn't loud, just a subtle, deliberate sound, like someone fiddling with the latch on the door. I lifted my head slightly, trying to position myself to better understand what that sound was. But as soon as I did, it stopped. I thought to myself that the wind must have been hitting some metal structure, and that's why the noise was intermittent. I must have fallen back asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up with sunlight hitting my face. I got up, walked a bit around the cabin to stretch my legs, made coffee on my little camp stove, and sat on the porch writing. By late afternoon, though, I had the slight impression of being watched. And when I looked at the trees to my right, I saw that someone was standing in the middle of the trees watching me. I stood up and waved, trying to figure out if the man had just arrived there, or if he had been watching me the whole time. When he didn't wave back, I called out and started walking toward him. That's when he stepped out from the trees, and I could see that he had something hanging from his hand. The way he was walking was threatening, as if he was going to use whatever he was holding against me. Obviously, I started backing up, and that's when I saw he was holding a scythe. I ran inside the cabin and locked myself in. When I peeked out the window, I saw he was already practically on top of the cabin. As soon as he saw me looking out the window, he just smiled and then dragged the scythe across his neck. I knew immediately that was a direct threat. I had no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but from his face and his movements, I knew he was completely out of his mind. I shouted that I was armed and that I had no problem using the weapon. I'm sure he heard what I said. The cabin had thin walls, but he didn't even react. He didn't smile again or make any more moves. He just stayed there. I was doing my best to stay calm, to be rational. But at this point, I was already panicking. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. I was in the middle of nowhere, with my car super far away. I had no way to call for help, and there was a psychopath threatening me outside the cabin. And even though the doors and windows were closed, I didn't know how long the walls would hold if he decided he wanted to come in. I closed all the shutters on the windows, so there was no visibility inside the cabin. And then I started thinking about every possible scenario. I needed to get out of there as fast as possible and run toward the car. The man was probably much more familiar with that forest than I was, so if I wanted to get out, I had to head straight for the car, without making mistakes. I gathered all the objects I could find in the cabin, especially the ones that were sharp or big enough to defend myself. At this point, it was already night, and I didn't know if it would be a good idea to venture out into the forest in the middle of the night. So I decided I would wait until morning, and then run for my life. Yes, it would be easier for him to see me, but it would also be easier for me to see him, and far harder for me to get lost. The last thing I wanted was to be completely lost in the middle of the forest at night with a murderous lunatic after me. I thought about sleeping, but the fear of him breaking into the cabin and me being completely vulnerable terrified me. At this point, I was also prepared to leave everything behind and take only the absolutely essential things to survive in case I didn't make it quickly to the car. And then, I heard a sort of scream coming from outside, along with the sound of someone choking. At least, That's what it seemed like. I opened the shutter of the window, and then I saw him, lying on the ground. The scythe still in his hand, but next to him. I couldn't distinguish anything else in the dark. I seriously thought about escaping right then. But what if it was all just a trick to lure me outside and catch me more easily? I wasn't going to fall for that. I was going to stick to the plan I had made. So I waited for morning to come. Hour after hour, I looked out the window again, and he was still there. I started to think maybe it wasn't a plan to lure me, and maybe someone had gotten to him before me, or maybe an animal. But if an animal had attacked him, it probably would have dragged the body. Morning finally came, and that's when I saw that all around him there was blood. He was clearly dead. I ran out of the cabin, barely looking at him, and didn't stop running until I reached the car. When I finally got service, I called the police and explained everything that had happened. They went to the cabin and found the man. A few days later, they called me to say that the investigation would end there. The results of the autopsy showed that he had large amounts of drugs in his system and multiple puncture wounds on his body. The simple image made me nauseous. He had died due to the combination of two drugs. That's why he was acting so strange, and that's why he wanted to kill me. Maybe he was hallucinating, and in his head I was a threat. The only thing that doesn't add up is the police telling me that the cabin I was renting was illegal, as was the site I had used. I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, but what's certain is that I'm not getting myself into anything like that again anytime soon. When I was young, we lived in this small town way out in the Appalachian Mountains called Irwin, Tennessee. It was the kind of place that felt cut off from the rest of the world, surrounded by ridges that made the town feel like a bowl you had to climb out of just to see anything else. It might sound exaggerated, but it's the reality. One day my uncle told me that, and the expression just stuck with me because it was exactly how I felt living there. The air always smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, and there wasn't much to do besides walk the tracks or hang out at someone's house after school. The good part, which I notice in contrast to today, is that we really played with each other back then. We didn't stay at home isolated. We were much closer in our friendships. This was early October, probably 2009. I was about 13 or 14 years old. Football season had started. The evenings were getting that sharp little bite in them, and you could smell people burning leaves in their yards. Back then, I didn't have much self-esteem, and so, even though I knew all the kids and played with them, I only felt genuinely comfortable with 2 or 3. One of those friends had a cousin with a property way up near Rock Creek Park, a real old place we were always hearing fascinating stories about. It was one of those farmhouses that looked like it should have collapsed 50 years ago, but somehow hadn't. The kind with sagging floors that moaned under your weight and wallpaper peeling in wide strips. The attic had this heavy iron latch on the door, and the cellar was a dirt hole in the ground, so black you couldn't even imagine the bottom. Even though I spent a lot of time in the house, I never went down there. Still, in daylight, the place worked like a clubhouse for us. That Friday, we decided we'd camp out in the yard, right at the tree line. I know I was very young, and it's strange these days for parents to have that kind of trust in kids. But my parents always let me play freely and make my own mistakes. I don't mean they were careless with me. They weren't. They just trusted me more. So, back to the idea of camping out that night. It felt adventurous, but safe enough. We dragged out an old canvas tent that smelled like mildew, set up a couple of kerosene lanterns, and stacked firewood. Most of the afternoon was spent messing around, throwing a football, daring each other to walk a few steps into the trees. The woods were thick, so thick the light seemed to vanish once you got more than 20 feet in. Even during the day, you felt like you were being swallowed. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridges, we had the fire going strong, and that's when I noticed it. The woods out there were alive with sound. Crickets, frogs, wind, until suddenly, they weren't. This is important because up to that moment, I wasn't conditioned in the way I am today. In other words, now I know that the real problem, when things start going wrong, or when there's a predator nearby, is that the normal sounds of the forest disappear. But, back then, I didn't know that. I was a kid. So, I think the fact that I noticed it and that it scared me was some kind of instinct I didn't even know I had. I mentioned it to my friends, and we laughed it off at first. I think that's a kind of defense mechanism, making jokes about things that scare us, trying in some way to strip away the scary part and replace it with a smile, something light and funny. So we kept playing. We joked about real things like bears and joked about ghosts. But everyone felt the mood shift. I could see it in the way we kept glancing over our shoulders. As we talked about scarier things, the smiles got smaller and less real. Later that night, maybe close to midnight, we were stretched out in our sleeping bags. The fire had burned down to a glow. The lantern threw these weak yellow halos against the tent walls. And that's when I started hearing sticks snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal moving through the brush. Maybe the bear we'd been joking about earlier, and that wasn't funny at all. But after a while, the sounds started coming from different spots. One to the left, one to the right, then a little farther back. Like something circling us in a slow and careful way. My stomach turned to ice, and by the look on my friends' faces, I knew they were feeling exactly the same thing. We knew we weren't as alone as we thought, and we knew it wasn't animals around us. None of us really moved. We were all just waiting for an adult to show up and pull us out of the situation. But after a few seconds, the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. Yet when I listened more closely, I realized the noise hadn't ended. It had just been replaced. No more snapping. Just another sound. A lot softer, like a steady rustle, almost like fabric brushing against bark. Again moving slow, and just far enough back that we couldn't see a thing. Every hair on my arm stood up. I kept picturing someone walking the perimeter, dragging their sleeve along the trees, wanting us to know they were there. We had heard so many stories that the last thing I wanted was to actually be in the middle of one. Then the strangest thing happened. My friend's cousin, the one who lived there, told us to lie down and pretend we were asleep. I don't know how he managed to get 3 panicked teenagers to obey him. But the reality is, we did. The tone of his voice was real fear, and that made us trust that, of all of us, he was the only one who knew what was happening. We didn't talk after that. We didn't even breathe heavy. We just lay there, pretending to be asleep, every muscle in our bodies locked tight. I was so tense my arm went completely numb. At some point, I don't know how long, because in moments of panic, a minute can feel like an hour, and an hour, like a minute. The sound drifted deeper into the woods, and the silence grew. Until finally, we stopped hearing whatever it was, and the noises that had been there before, like the sound of the crickets, came back. That was when my friend's cousin told us to get up, and we all ran inside the house. He explained to us that in that area there was a legend about a spirit that roamed looking for the living to drag them into the forest. The only way to fight it was to pretend you weren't alive. At the time, we all accepted that explanation and just stopped going to his house. So many years later, I know that what probably happened is that some animal, probably a predator, was nearby. Many animals lose interest when you don't react, and that was probably what happened. Rationally, I know it was just an animal, but it was still a terrifying situation, and one that made me believe in ghosts and legends for a long time. I think a part of me has always wondered if the story of the spirit might have some shred of truth, even though rationally I know it doesn't. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In today's video, we're heading back to one of the most stunning and straight-up scary places in the US, the Appalachian Mountains. I've been loving making these videos and reading all the wild stories you've sent in about this region. In one of today's stories, we'll follow a group of friends who took a trip out to the Smokies and ran into something downright bizarre. And in another, we'll hear from a park ranger who opened up about one of the strangest things he's ever experienced on the job. Thanks for hanging out with me. And as always, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're feeling extra generous, go ahead and share this with your friends. It really helps the channel a ton. Alright, let's get into it. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Alright guys, so buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound absolutely insane, and if I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd probably think it was some campfire creepypasta too. But it's real. Or at least it felt damn real. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but I need to get this story off my chest before it eats me alive. Maybe someone out there's heard something similar. Maybe you've been in the Smokies and seen things you couldn't explain. I've replayed this story in my head 1,000 times. So this all happened at the tail end of April 2024. But to really understand why it shook me so bad, you need the backstory, which starts about 6 years earlier. Back in 2017, I joined this kinda scrappy Facebook group for amateur hikers. It was nothing fancy. Just a loose collection of dudes across the southeast who wanted to hike more but didn't have buddies into it. You'd post a trail, see who wanted in, meet up, and hit the woods. That's how I met Jared, Mark, Spencer, and John. Over time, the 5 of us formed a solid crew. We'd plan 2- and 3-day hikes across Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, anywhere with trees and some elevation. We got close, not just in a we camp together way, but in a share your weird dreams and fight over the last can of chili kind of way. You don't get that often past your 20s. For years, we kept talking about hitting the Great Smoky Mountains. It's like the crown jewel around here, but somehow it just kept slipping through the cracks. Either bad timing, weather, permits. We had all the excuses. But last April, we finally made it happen. We planned a 5-day trek through one of the less traveled sections, the kind of path you don't find on Pinterest lists or beginner blogs. This stretch was remote as hell. Primitive shelters spaced far apart, steep inclines, dense forest. The good stuff. We all met up at the trailhead on a crisp Wednesday morning. There was frost on the grass and our breath fogged up when we talked. Not the typical weather for this time of year. But at higher elevations in the Smokies, you can still get some cold snaps in spring. We parked our cars on this sketchy little gravel road that might as well have been a logging path and started hiking. The first day was stunning. Clear skies, spring buds starting to pop, fresh leaves underfoot. That kind of quiet you only get when you're miles away from anything resembling a town. We reached the first shelter around 6 p.m. just as the sun started bleeding orange across the sky. It was one of those classic 3-wall wooden shelters, a little rickety, but it held up. When we rolled in, there was already someone there, which was unexpected but not totally unusual. He looked maybe mid-40s, rough around the edges type with this weather-beaten tan coat, a bushy gray beard, and a backpack that had clearly seen better decades. He said his name was Ray, claimed he was a hunter. When we asked what he was hunting, he kind of smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes and said, "Not sure you'd believe me." We laughed it off, figured he was just one of those dudes who liked the sound of his own mystery. None of the five of us really cared about hunting or hearing hunting stories, so we didn't ask. If he wanted to play mysterious, we let him. We cooked our dried dinners, told some old stories, and turned in as the rain started tapping on the roof. Nothing too serious, it was just a light drizzle, pretty common in that area, and something we were already expecting. I remember that morning clearly, mostly because I'd slept unusually well, all things considered. I wasn't in a bed. I was zipped inside a sleeping bag, half exposed to the woods, sharing a shelter with 5 other guys. Still, I felt rested. That was my first thought when I opened my eyes. But almost immediately I realized someone was already up. Jared wasn't in his bag. I sat up and spotted him outside the shelter, standing completely still, staring at the ground like he was trying to figure something out. He must have felt me watching, because he glanced over his shoulder and gave me a subtle wave, like, "Come look at this." Something in his face told me it wasn't nothing. When I stepped outside and reached the edge of the shelter, I saw it. The ground was a mess of footprints, dozens of them, all barefoot. They were small, maybe a woman's size or a teenager's, but something wasn't right. The shape was strange. The toes were too long, almost like fingers. There was no sign of a struggle, no skid marks or drag lines. Just those weird, clean prints stamped deep into the wet earth, circling our shelter. We ended up waking the others, hoping maybe one of them had sleepwalked or something. As unlikely as it was, part of me still wanted it to be one of us. Anything to make sense of those prints. But no. Everyone still had their socks on, clean and dry. Their boots were soaked, still caked with mud from the day before, except for Ray's. His boots were bone dry. That alone would have been strange enough, but the way he acted made it worse. While the rest of us stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Ray barely reacted. It was like he'd expected it. He looked down at the prints for a moment, then calmly started packing his gear. He told us he'd be continuing the trail on his own. We asked if he knew what had made those tracks, and by the way he answered, it was obvious he did. Said that was the reason he'd come out there in the first place. Someone asked if it was some kind of animal, and he just shrugged it off. Then he mentioned something about those mountains being older than we realized. Then, he slung his pack over his shoulder and walked off in the direction of the prints. The rest of us just stood there, staring at each other, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. We figured it was best to keep moving too, but in the opposite direction of the footprints, and of Ray. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same. We spent most of the day tossing around theories, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some weird locals messing around. And yeah, we even brought up the old legends, stories we'd heard growing up about strange things living out in these mountains. By the time the sun started going down, we were exhausted, mentally and physically. We just wanted to forget the whole thing. We told ourselves we were far enough away now, that whatever it was, it wouldn't happen again. And even though some of us talked about heading back early, we convinced ourselves it was probably a prank and decided to stick to the plan, at least for one more night. But obviously, we were wrong and the story didn't end there. New shelter, same freaking thing. It had rained lightly, and in the morning, there they were, more of those bizarre barefoot prints. This time, there were more. A lot more. We counted nearly 11 distinct prints, maybe more, like whoever or whatever was out there had been pacing around us all night long. That was the moment it really sank in for all of us. Something wasn't right out there, and whatever it was, it had been close. Too close. I've always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of guy who could sleep through a storm. But Mark wakes up if a branch shifts in the wind. He kept going on about how there was no way something, or someone, could have been circling us without making a sound. Not a single snap, not a crunch. Even on soft ground, you'd expect a noise. But it was like they floated. 5 grown men, dead asleep, while those prints were being laid down just feet from where we slept. It didn't add up. None of it did. By the 4th night, nerves were frayed. We were physically exhausted, emotionally wrecked, and the weather turned nasty. Cold, relentless rain hammered the forest, soaking everything. The final shelter was more rundown than the rest, like no one had used it in years. We huddled inside, barely talking. Something had changed. The woods felt aware. That's the only word I've got for it. That night, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. So even though we were sleeping in a shelter, we rigged up a tarp over the entrance to block the wind and rain. We also agreed not to all sleep at once, just in case. We took shifts. I was on watch around 4:30 a.m., sitting there in the dark, gun in hand, mostly just listening to the storm batter the trees. And then I saw movement. I was looking through a small gap we'd left near the tarp, barely wide enough to notice unless you knew it was there. And through that sliver, I saw them. They stepped out from the tree line like a hallucination. 7 figures. Human-like, but wrong. Too small. Not like little people, but like adults who never fully developed. Every part of them seemed off, frail, undergrown, almost fragile. They were completely naked and somehow unfazed by the cold. Just walking slowly, silently, circling the shelter like they were studying it. I was frozen, gun in hand, but completely locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was clearly terrified, but weirdly fascinated too. What the hell was I looking at? I reached over and tapped Mark's leg. He woke up like he'd been trained for it. I motioned for silence and shifted so he could take my spot and see for himself. But as he moved, the plastic on his sleeping bag made the tiniest noise. And that was enough. The figures bolted, darted back into the forest like animals. By the time he got a clear look, all he caught was their backs disappearing into the dark. They moved impossibly fast and quiet, like the forest swallowed them whole. We sat there in silence, the kind that feels thick and full of questions. I could feel his body tense next to mine, like the fear had seeped into his muscles. When he finally whispered, he just asked what the hell that was. I didn't have an answer. I was just relieved he saw them too, because if he hadn't, I would have spent the rest of my life trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. They were moving in these smooth, floating circles. Not like they were sneaking, but like they had all the time in the world. Their limbs were too long, knees bending a little wrong, and they made no sound. The ground was soggy mud, and they were barefoot, but not a single squish or squelch. It was like they were weightless. Eventually, we woke the others to tell them what had just happened. Honestly, both of us felt ridiculous saying it out loud, but no one questioned it. No one laughed or pushed back. I think deep down, they all already knew something was out there, and now Two of us had seen it with our own eyes. At least now we could put a shape to those footprints. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Even though they didn't seem dangerous and hadn't done anything to us. In fact, they'd run the moment they heard a noise. We still decided it was time to get out of those mountains. We couldn't make sense of what we'd seen. Truth is, none of us had ever heard stories about feral people in the Smokies. Sure, we'd heard rumors from other parts of the Appalachian Trail, but never in this area. In fact, we didn't even know if they were people. Yeah, they looked more like people than any other animal. But at the same time, their bodies were just bizarre. We filed a report with the rangers when we got back, told them everything. One of them took notes, nodded slowly, and when we pushed him for answers, he just smiled and said, "Lot of stories up in those woods. Most of them don't lead anywhere." But it wasn't the kind of smile that says he doesn't believe you. It was the kind that says he's heard this before, maybe too many times. And now, I can't stop wondering about Ray. That dude knew. I'm convinced of it. He came out there to hunt, but didn't say what. I don't think he was out there for deer or bear. I think he was after those things. And the truth is, that thought really saddens me. Despite everything, those things weren't dangerous. They didn't try to interact with us. They didn't try to hurt us. What scares me is how people can't seem to handle the unknown without feeling the need to destroy it. My name is Liam, and 5 years ago I retired. I was a park ranger my entire life, and, as you can imagine, I have enough material to write several books about everything I've seen and experienced in our national parks. As you might expect, there's a lot I'm not at liberty to say openly, but over the years I've shared a few stories, some quirky with happy endings, others deeply disturbing with the worst outcomes imaginable. And then there are the ones I consider the worst of all, the ones that remain unexplained, the ones that leave us with only one certainty, that something truly terrible happened, even if we don't know exactly what. Those are, in fact, the hardest to bear, because they're the ones that haunt us, that stay with us over the years, and keep us up at night. This particular story I'm about to tell you is one that's been keeping me up for years. And what eats away at me the most isn't even the violence of what I witnessed, but the lack of answers, the absolute silence from the proper authorities. What upsets me the most is feeling like maybe I never got any explanation, not because there wasn't one, but because they simply didn't want to give it to me. Because, and I am sure of this, something confidential is going on in those mountains. Like I said, this all happened quite a few years ago, and at the time, the search and rescue tools and protocols were very different from what we have now. Far less developed, and a lot more limited. Starting from the beginning. That night I was on patrol in a section of the Appalachian Trail. Forgive me for not being more specific, but I've gotten into trouble before for trying to bring this story to light, so this time I'm playing it safe. What I can tell you is that it happened in an area long considered problematic, where disappearances occur way more often than in other forests, and where crimes, when they do happen, tend to be especially brutal and violent. Working that area always had a strange duality to it. On one hand, it's breathtakingly beautiful, but on the other, it forces you to stay constantly alert, 200% focused, always paying attention to your surroundings, because at any given moment, some unhinged person could show up ready to cause trouble. Night had just fallen when I got an order to investigate a campsite that, according to reports, had been abandoned. The family of a couple had raised the alarm after losing contact with them, and the woman was found in a chaotic state. Up to that point, only the woman had been found, wandering alone down a road, in a state of deep shock, with her clothes torn and unable to form coherent sentences. She'd been taken to the hospital the day before, but the truth was, very little was known. My mission was to locate where they had camped and, if I could confirm the spot, call for backup. The man, as of then, was still missing. No one knew where he was. And according to the woman herself, she didn't even seem to remember having a husband. That's how confused and mentally scattered she was. Finding the campsite wasn't hard, since the family had a pretty good idea of where they wanted to camp and even had some rough coordinates. The hardest part was actually dealing with what I found there and trying to make any logical sense of what might have happened. I'd been hiking for around 45 minutes when I started hearing sounds in the distance. At first, I assumed it was an animal, something totally normal and, honestly, not something that worried me in the slightest. But as I got closer, I started to realize there was something oddly human about those sounds. When I finally reached the clearing, I was met with a scene of total destruction. The campsite was completely trashed, and in the middle of the chaos was a man in rags digging a massive hole with his bare hands. He was doing it compulsively, frenetically, almost like an animal, with his fingertips bloody and caked with dirt, in such a disturbing state that I froze for a few seconds. I should have called for backup immediately, but the truth is, I was so shocked by the image in front of me that I chose instead to approach slowly, trying to understand what was going on. Not for a second did I think he could be dangerous, until he punched me square in the face, knocking me backward, my head hitting a rock, and I blacked out instantly. When I woke up, it was pitch dark. The pain at the back of my head was unbearable, and there was no sign of the man anywhere. My radio was still on, and luckily, when they lost my signal, they sent in an emergency team. I got up with difficulty, still staggering, and tried to figure out what was going on around me. Even though the campsite looked like it had been attacked by wild animals, everything turned upside down, food scattered, tent half collapsed. What really unsettled me was the complete silence. Not a sound. Just total, silent chaos. I searched the tent, which was empty, and started walking around. There were signs of rotting food, dirty clothes, several barefoot footprints that seemed to belong to different people. And that's when I heard something. Faint breathing. Almost imperceptible. That made me realize I wasn't alone. I looked around instinctively, but saw no one. My eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing, the dense, dark trees. And that's when I remembered the hole the man had been digging. I headed over, and when I peeked inside, I felt a deep chill. The man was lying at the bottom of the hole, motionless, curled up almost in a fetal position, like he was either dead or asleep. Despite the scare, I could see his chest rising and falling. That's when I realized just how huge that hole was. It was big enough to fit a full-grown adult without having to crouch. The ground was tough, full of thick roots and tall grass. How long had it taken him to dig that with nothing but his hands? I took cover in the woods, hiding, and called for backup. I didn't want to wake the man and risk any kind of confrontation, so I stayed hidden until help arrived. It was a relief to know they were already on their way and would be there soon. When the team finally got there, getting the man out of the hole was anything but easy. He was in full survival mode, aggressive and disoriented, like a trapped animal. That was the moment it became crystal clear to me that something truly traumatic had happened to them. The family hadn't heard from them in over 2 weeks, and until the woman was found, they thought everything was fine. But their behavior, especially the look in that man's eyes, wasn't just fear. It was the look of someone permanently scarred by something that can't be explained. Both were taken to the hospital, and an investigation was launched. But I never got any answers. Every time I tried to learn more from my superiors, they just told me my job was done and there was nothing to report. Among the other rangers, theories started circulating. Some said they were on drugs, that they'd eaten some toxic plant, or that they were hallucinating from hunger. But none of us had the faintest idea what really happened. I later found out that the woman, despite her fragmented speech, kept insisting they were attacked by people from the forest. And that's when I remembered something I'd brushed off before, maybe because of the blow to my head. The campsite was full of barefoot footprints. The man was wearing shoes when we found him. Same with the woman. Sure, they could have walked around barefoot at some point, but there were too many footprints, and they looked like they belonged to different people. Why wasn't any of this mentioned in the official reports? I don't have proof of what I'm telling you. All I have is my gut, telling me something more happened in that forest, and no one wants to talk about it. One detail I've never been able to forget is that both of them had deep wounds on their bodies. Wounds that couldn't have been self-inflicted. Either they attacked each other, which seems unlikely, or they were attacked by someone else. But by who? And why? Months later, I tried to contact them or their families, but was told they didn't want to talk about it anymore. I tried to move on, I swear I did. But 2 years later, in that exact same spot, 3 friends emerged from the woods in a state of absolute panic, claiming they'd been chased by a group of people. The investigation was shallow, almost symbolic, and it was said that the whole thing was just something the kids made up for attention. But I saw one of them, I saw his face. And I know that no one fakes that kind of fear. No one acts out pure panic that well, especially not to get on the news. And this case, once again, didn't even make it to the news. The truth is, I don't have answers, only questions. And something tells me I'll die, never knowing what really goes on in that forgotten part of the Appalachian Mountains. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 terrifying stories from deep within the Appalachian forests. Stories of people who ventured too far and came face to face with something they'll never forget. From a group of friends who lost one of their own, to a man who hears a voice calling out to him in the darkness, and finally, a birthday celebration in a remote cabin that turns into a night of pure horror. Before we begin, I just want to thank everyone who commented on the last video and shared where you're watching from. It's genuinely amazing to see that this community is growing from all over the world, and that we're all connected. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Back in 1987, when I was 23, something happened to me and my friends that still haunts me to this day. Everyone's names in this story have been changed, but every single detail is true. I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but the people involved in this story are real people, and something truly terrible happened. I need to tell this to someone. But since I have no right to stir up this story again, at least not by using real names, I'll leave those out. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that this all happened many years ago, in 1987, at a time when things were drastically different, from the way you asked for help to the way investigations were conducted. Maybe that's why we never got any real answers about what happened to one of us. So, in October of that year, me and 5 friends decided to do a week-long hike through the Appalachian Mountains. We had already done several hikes and camping trips together, but never in this part of the country, and never so far into the wilderness. We were perfectly aware that our plan was ambitious. About 80 miles from the north entrance down to Pactola Lake. We wanted to disconnect from the city, escape our jobs, and just breathe. Laura was our guide of sorts. She'd been in the National Guard, skilled with maps and compasses, and she kept us all feeling relatively safe. She had always been the kind of person who takes charge of a situation and knows exactly what to do. She was more than prepared to help us survive in nature. What she wasn't prepared for was how cruel and disturbed the minds of some people hiding in that very nature could be. So, we stocked up on food and supplies at a small store in Rapid City. When I mentioned where we were headed, the cashier went pale. "People disappear out there all the time," she said. "There are things out there you don't want to see." We didn't really react at the time because the truth is, we had already heard plenty of ghost stories and other tales about creatures haunting the forest. But in reality, there was never any real proof that any of those stories were true, and we weren't about to give up our adventure just because some people like to make things up. We didn't confront the lady. Everyone believes what they want. We just smiled. But as we were loading the groceries into the car, the man who had been behind us in line came over and told us not to worry about what people said around there. As long as we stayed on the trail, everything would be fine. We thanked him and went on our way. Still, the truth is, that interaction with the man left me more unsettled than I admitted. One thing is people and their superstitions. Another is someone who seemed to know what he was talking about, telling us to stay on the trail. It didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a warning. And the truth is, we were planning to leave the trail. But no one commented on it, and I didn't want to break the group's spirit, so we just kept going. The first 2 days of hiking were perfect, except for one situation that we kind of ignored. Spirits were high, we were young and in shape, and the forest was beautiful in that crisp October air. Near the end of the first trail, close to the area where we planned to leave the path and explore off-trail, we spotted a camp in the distance. But it was the strangest camp I had ever seen. The tents were in terrible shape, old and torn apart. But worse were the 3 people outside. Each one of them was wearing a white mask. It shocked us not only because of the masks themselves, but because they were wearing them around each other. If they were trying to scare someone, it would make more sense. But no. They were sitting in a circle around a fire, talking to one another. Even though it was obviously disturbing, we were far enough away that they hadn't seen us. At least I thought they hadn't. So we just stayed silent, kept our distance, and got out of there fast. By the next day, our second day, nothing had happened, and we were keeping a good pace. By nightfall, none of us were even talking about those 3 anymore. They had already slipped from our memory. But the third night changed everything, and when I say everything, I really mean it. One of us went into that forest and never came back out. That night, we did exactly what we had done the 2 nights before. We set up camp in a clearing near a creek, splitting between 2 tents. We spent some time around the fire talking, and then one by one everyone drifted off to bed. Even though I was one of the first to lie down, around 3 in the morning I still couldn't sleep. Melissa was awake too, complaining about her back. So we were sitting in her tent, quietly playing cards. That's when we heard it. Soft, crunching footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was someone going to the bathroom, normal in a big group like ours. But 5 minutes passed, then 10, and we didn't hear anything else. Then I looked up from the cards at Melissa and saw the panic on her face. She had peeked through the small window in the side of the tent and had clearly seen something that terrified her. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. I leaned over the flap and saw them. 3 figures, maybe 20 yards from our camp, standing completely still. Masks covered their faces, crude, featureless cloth that hid every expression. And their clothes were ragged, like they had made them themselves. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were just watching. I knew immediately it was the same 3 we had seen days before. I gave Melissa the same signal, covering my mouth to stop myself from screaming. Melissa barely breathed. For what felt like an eternity, we didn't move. Then, the zipper of the other tent slid open. We didn't know if it was our friends coming out to investigate the noise, or those 3 who might have moved over to unzip it. We both leaned to see, but it all happened too fast for us to react. A scream cut through the forest. Sharp and short. It was a man's scream, but it didn't sound like anyone we knew. At the same moment, Laura rushed into our tent. She shoved a knife into our hands, her face a mix of panic and the cold determination of someone on a mission. She said the men were back. She didn't know what they wanted, but whatever it was, we had to be ready to fight and run. Then she told us Tom had disappeared. No one knew where he was. She left the tent again and took up a defensive stance right in front of it. Now that the tent was wide open, we could see them clearly. They were still standing there, in exactly the same position, just staring at us. Laura yelled that we were armed and that she had experience. It wasn't true that we were armed, but it was true she had experience, and with the right motivation, she probably could have handled them. But they didn't react. They just stayed put, watching. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. She called out for Tom again, but nothing. The forest around us was completely silent. Nobody moved, waiting for the other to make the first move. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Honestly, I really don't. But Laura insists it was only a short time. They simply turned around and walked back into the woods until we couldn't see them anymore. None of us moved. We didn't know if they would come back. The only thing we knew for sure was that Tom was still missing. We called out for him several times throughout the night. But nothing. None of us dared to venture into the dark forest. By 7, the sun had risen enough that we felt safe moving, searching the area to see where he might be. After an hour with no luck, we knew we had to get help. An investigation was launched that lasted more than 3 weeks. Several volunteers joined the search, but Tom was never found. The only thing discovered was one sock with blood on it. Nothing more. Almost 40 years have passed since then, and we've been told the investigation has been reopened. I hope that this time we'll finally get some answers about what might have happened the night we lost our friend, and that maybe some light will be shed on who those 3 men really were. get ready. Because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely ridiculous. And, at the same time, for someone who went through and lived what happened, terrifying. Because what I'm about to tell you has been clawing at my brain for over 20 years now. I haven't told a single person face to face, because I know exactly how it sounds. Completely unhinged. But it happened, and the silence has been eating me alive. As I've seen some people say in this type of situation, maybe putting it out here will help me move on. Although, I suspect the only thing it will do is remind me how fragile we really are when we think we're alone in the woods. Either way, here it is. This all went down in October of 1999. If you weren't there, or you were too young, you probably don't realize how different everything was back then. Cell phones already existed, but there wasn't even close to the kind of dependence there is today. No constant tether to someone on the other end of a screen. When you went into the woods in '99, you were gone. If something happened, you were on your own. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, although I think the magic has been completely lost. My goal in saying this is simply to give a fact that in a way is important to the story. I didn't have a cell phone. So, going back to that time, I used to be a hardcore hiker, backpacking every chance I got through Tennessee, North Carolina, even up into Virginia. For years, I'd hit the trails almost every other weekend. I wasn't reckless, but I loved going solo. No chatter, no phones, just me and the sound of my boots on dirt. It was the closest thing to peace I ever found. But life got in the way. Work piled up, relationships went sideways, and before I knew it, years had passed since I'd done a real trip. Until that fall of '99. When I finally snapped out of it and decided I was done wasting time. I dug out my old gear, cleaned off my stove, unfolded the creased paper topo maps, and picked a trail in the Smokies I'd always wanted to try. A stretch so remote that back then there wasn't any other trail nearby. I gave myself 4 days, enough to shake the rust off, but not so long I'd be dragging myself home broken. I prepped like I always did. Extra food, emergency pack, compass, and a battered flashlight with spare batteries. But I can admit now that I was cocky. I thought the years hadn't dulled me as much as they had. Day 1 was perfect. Cool breeze, clear sky, and the constant sound of leaves being crushed underfoot. My legs burned. But it was that good burn. The kind that makes you remember you're alive. The forest smelled like damp moss and old pine needles, and the streams were still running high from September rains. I didn't see another human after the parking lot. That night, though, things shifted. It wasn't anything obvious. Just this nagging sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I'd set up camp beside a small clearing, got a fire going, cooked my usual dehydrated meal, and the whole time, it felt like someone was watching from the tree line. I kept glancing up mid-bite, expecting to catch a pair of eyes reflecting back. But there was nothing but darkness. It's important to say that at this point I wasn't scared at all. I was just alert. To survive when we're completely isolated, you can't just switch off your intuition. It exists for a reason. Besides, I'd already encountered my fair share of crazy people on trails I'd hiked before. In all those cases when I ran into weirdos or more dangerous situations, what saved me was precisely using my intuition. trusting my instincts. So this experience wasn't going to be any different. Sure, it's true that I hadn't gone on a trail like this in a few years. But I still knew what it felt like when something wasn't right. When you're being watched. So that night I took the proper precautions. I kept my food away from the campsite and laid several dry branches around the tent. If someone or some animal approached, I'd have time to hear it. But, aside from the feeling, nothing else happened that night. So I moved on. The second day, I pushed deeper. The path narrowed, climbed hard in spots, cut across ridges where the wind howled like a freight train. It was beautiful. But every so often, I'd get this flash of movement just beyond the corner of my vision. Once I swore, I saw something slipping behind a tree about 50 yards off. A shape low to the ground, pale against the dark bark. Obviously, I stood still trying to figure out what kind of animal it could be, and whether I was in danger. But after a few minutes, nothing happened. It was as if nothing had been there at all. By the time I set camp again, I was a bit on edge. I'd had some uncomfortable signs during the day, and I knew perfectly well they weren't monkeys in my head. My fire that night felt less like comfort and more like a barrier, light keeping whatever was out there away. I was stirring the coals when I heard it. Not footsteps, exactly, but something heavy, shifting on soft ground. Too deliberate for the wind, and too steady to be a random sound of the forest. My chest locked up. Bears crossed my mind. But this didn't sound like that. It wasn't crashing. It wasn't snuffling around. It was controlled and maybe calculated. Instinctively, I grabbed my light and swept the trees. But once again, I couldn't see anything. The fire also didn't help. It was great for seeing what was close, but it obscured anything beyond its light. Then, out of the corner of the firelight, I saw it. A low and almost crawling movement, balanced on 4 limbs, sliding between the trunks with this wrong, uneven rhythm. My brain screamed, animal. But no animal I'd ever seen moved like that. Its skin, or fur, or whatever it was, seemed too pale, almost gray-blue in the firelight, like something that hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. In fact, I'd only managed to see it among the trees because it clearly wasn't an animal that needed to camouflage itself. Even so, I could only see part of it. My brain was working overtime trying to figure out what kind of animal it was and what the best plan would be. And then, my own voice came out of the dark, clear as if I was standing 5 feet behind me. "Wanna play?" It was like the ground fell out from under me. Cold shot through my whole body. My heart stuttered. I didn't move, and I didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed to react, to do something. But I knew, with a certainty I can't explain, that answering back would be the end of me. I sat frozen, staring into the trees, gripping the handle of my knife like a lifeline. I already knew not to leave the fire. I stayed as close to it as possible. I kept the flame alive, feeding it every piece of wood I had, praying it would keep the dark at bay. Whatever was out there didn't leave. I could hear it circling, shifting. Sometimes close enough I swore I could feel the vibration in the dirt. It never crashed through the underbrush. It slid, like it knew exactly how to move without a sound. I know it's hard to picture what I'm saying, but this is exactly what I felt at the time. And then again, I heard my own voice. At this point, I didn't understand what was said, but something was clearly said, and the voice was still mine. I wanted to scream, to charge into the woods swinging, to scare it off, to do anything but sit there like prey. But I knew in my bones that reacting was what it wanted. So I stayed still, clenched my teeth, eyes locked on the tree line, until dawn broke. When the sun finally lit the forest, I didn't waste a second. I didn't pack my tent. I didn't touch my stove. I shoved my emergency kit into my pack and bolted down the trail like hell was chasing me. I ran until my legs were jelly and until I saw the gravel road and my car. Then I just peeled out without looking back. I've never told anyone except my brother until now. Not because I don't want to be believed, but because I don't even believe myself. What do you even call that? A hallucination? A psychotic break? But the thing is, I don't drink from random streams. I don't eat berries. I didn't take anything that could have poisoned me. The idea that I randomly hallucinated my own voice out there feels as absurd as the alternative. And yet, I can still hear it. The tone, the cadence. It was, without any shadow of a doubt, my exact voice. It's been over 2 decades and I haven't set foot back in the Smokies. I don't know if I ever will. Everything I'm about to tell you happened at the end of October 1987, when I had just turned 20 years old. Just so you know, things back then were very different from what they are now. We were more united as a society, and it breaks my heart to see how divided we've become. Anyway, that's just something I wanted to share. Like I said, I had just turned 20, and to celebrate properly, my closest group of friends and I decided to spend 5 days in a cabin isolated deep in the woods. It wasn't just any cabin either. It belonged to one of my friend's uncles. 4 guys who had grown up together in the same little corner of Western Virginia, just close enough to the Appalachian ridges to think the mountains were our backyard. The cabin was more like an oversized hunting shack, set back in the woods, no electricity, no running water. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and to us, that was paradise. We didn't have any plans for those days except drinking beer, talking by the campfire, and maybe going on a hike or 2. The first 3 nights were exactly that. The cabin was rough. Old timber, warped shutters, a wood stove that filled the room with smoke if you fed it too much at once. But we didn't care. We cooked hot dogs on sticks, drank cheap beer until we couldn't feel the cold, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the wind moving through the trees. It was simple, and it was good. Those were definitely good times. The 4th and final night was when things changed. That night was much colder and damper than the ones before. Instead of being outside by a fire, we stayed inside the cabin. As usual, we kept the windows slightly open to let some air in and keep the smoke from building up inside. Around midnight, as we were sitting on the couch, Evan and I both saw something. The problem was, we saw the same thing, but in opposite windows. Out there in the pitch-black forest, something glimmered back at us. A pair of eyes. We both jumped up at the same time and realized we were looking at the same thing. Luckily, we reacted fast. All 4 of us understood what was happening and rushed to close the windows and double-check the door. We stayed alert. None of us knew what was out there. All we had seen was what looked like a pair of eyes low to the ground. We weren't exactly scared yet. The area was known for wild animals, and since the eyes were so low, we figured it might be wolves. The fact that we had seen more than one pair of eyes and seen them in opposite windows almost confirmed it. They must have been animals moving in a pack, possibly hunting together. At that point, we still hadn't closed the shutters, so we could still see out into the woods. But there was nothing more to see than the vastness of the forest and the darkness between the trees. At one point, Frederick said what he'd seen wasn't an animal. He said it in such an absolute, unnerving way that I immediately knew he wasn't joking. We shut the shutters then, but even so, we still didn't know what we had seen. Frederick himself, after saying that, couldn't explain what he'd seen. He just kept saying it wasn't an animal. He didn't know what it was. Maybe a very sick or deformed animal. We kept pressing him with questions, and he just said he didn't know, but that the best thing was to keep the shutters closed. For hours, we heard noises outside the cabin. Obviously, none of us were going to sleep that night. We heard something crawling around outside, something scratching at the wood. It was absolutely terrifying. I really thought it was a pack of wolves, maybe hungry ones. But then we heard whatever it was climb onto the roof and start moving from one side to the other. Wolves were agile, but I didn't think they could climb that high. Maybe cougars, I thought. But cougars rarely hunted in groups. All through that night we talked through every possible scenario. We grabbed whatever objects we could use to defend ourselves in case the cabin wasn't strong enough and gave way. The idea was terrifying, mostly because we didn't know what was on the other side. We even talked about the possibility that it could be people. But Frederick said, if they were people, they were highly deformed. Not to mention, I had seen the eyes low to the ground, which meant if it was a person, they were crawling on all fours. The idea that it could be people was horrifying. Not just because we didn't know their intentions, but because we didn't know what could be happening to them to make them act like that. At that time, it was common to hear talk about feral people, but nothing had ever been proven. When morning finally came and we hadn't heard any noises for a while, we opened the shutters to look outside. Nothing. The forest was still and serene, just like it had been every other day. But the ground was clearly trampled, like several people or animals had been circling the cabin. We couldn't make out distinct footprints, at least not from where we were. So the doubt remained about what had been out there. We packed up the rest of our things, and only when we opened the door and stepped outside did we realize it couldn't have been animals. The scratching noises we'd heard the night before had been to make all those marks on the cabin. The cabin was completely covered in them, but they weren't just random scratches that any animal could have made. They were symbols, drawings even, something only a person could have done. We got out of there as fast as we could. When we told my friend's uncle what had happened, he and a couple of his friends searched the woods around the cabin, trying to figure out what had gone on, but they never found anything. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories of people who went deep into Appalachia, into its most remote corners, expecting peace and solitude, but instead finding things truly terrifying. From cabins being broken into, to people hiding dark secrets for years, to serial killers still out there on the loose. Every one of these stories shook me, but the last one, it left me completely unsettled. because there's simply no explanation for it. Pure evil and psychopathy like that gets under my skin. I hope you enjoy this video as much as I did putting it together. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I own a small cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains. It isn't anything fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. But it's my little escape whenever life in the city starts to grind me down. Whenever I feel burned out or need to clear my head, I pack up the truck and head there. It always felt like my safe place. This was back in 2019. I'd just driven about 8 hours north, and by the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was long gone and the forest was pitch black. The final stretch of road is narrow, with tree branches that scratch against the side of the truck if I'm not careful. I pulled up around 8 p.m., relieved to be there. First thing I always do is fire up the generator, then haul my luggage inside. But that night, the second I unlocked the front door, I noticed something was off. The air inside was colder than it should have been, colder even than outside. More than that, I felt a draft and pushed the door. When I flicked on the light, my stomach dropped. One of the living room windows was completely shattered, glass all over the floor. I froze in the doorway for a good minute, my mind racing. I forced myself to do a walkthrough, gripping a fireplace poker like a weapon. But nothing seemed disturbed. The drawers were untouched, the kitchen cabinet still closed. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. Besides that, there were no marks on the ground. It had rained all week, so if anyone had come through there, they would have left footprints. The truth is, I hadn't been up to the cabin in about a year, so that window like that could have been something old. So I told myself it had to have been an animal. Maybe a bear had smelled something, pawed at the window, then left when it didn't find food. I'd seen claw marks on trees near the cabin before, so the thought wasn't far-fetched. Still, my nerves were a bit frayed. Since it was too late to drive back into town for supplies, I nailed an old piece of wood I had lying around over the opening to block out the cold and sleep more comfortably. Still, it was fragile, and if someone wanted to, they could easily get in. I set some firewood in the fireplace, lit it, and soon the cabin glowed with that soft orange light I'd always loved. I made myself a quick sandwich, poured a whiskey, and curled up on the couch with a book. I was reading The Collector by John Fowles, and the irony of reading a horror book in a situation like that didn't escape me. Maybe next time I came up to the cabin, I'd bring something a little lighter and more uplifting. Despite the broken window, the sounds of the forest drifting in were oddly calming. Crickets, the occasional owl, the pop and crackle of the fire. It didn't take long before my eyelids got heavy. Around 11, I topped off the fire, shut the lights, and went to the bedroom. I set my alarm for 7 a.m. on my phone. I always keep it on the nightstand, and drifted off. Then, at 2:34 a.m., I jolted awake. My chest was pounding like I'd been yanked out of a nightmare, but I couldn't remember what I'd been dreaming about. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But something felt wrong. The way I had just woken up had been a bit violent, and it left me feeling suspicious. I got up, phone in hand out of habit, and carefully cracked open the bedroom door. The glow from the moonlight partially lit the hallway, just enough for me to see. I pressed the light switch, but nothing turned on. Something urged me toward the window I'd found broken, and that's when I noticed the piece of wood I'd nailed over it was lying on the floor. My stomach flipped. I stepped closer and saw muddy boot prints leading in from the broken window. My throat went dry. I followed the prints with my eyes, across the floor, down the hall. They stopped right where I was standing. Slowly, I turned my head and realized they continued into the bedroom I'd just come from. I felt cold all over. By this point, my subconscious already knew I wasn't alone in that cabin. I forced myself back into the room, and that's when the horror hit me. The prints didn't stop at the doorway. They went right up to my bed, and there were no tracks leading away. I thought about moving closer to the bed and peeking underneath, but it wasn't necessary. Every part of me knew someone was there. I stepped back, and the person, sensing that I knew, lifted their head and smiled at me. A smile that was pure psychopathy. I shot upright so fast I slammed into the doorway, nearly knocking the breath out of myself. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed my keys, clutched my phone, and sprinted out the front door. I didn't even think. I just jumped into the truck, locked the doors, and tore off down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides. Halfway to town, I finally caught my breath enough to call the police. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. They told me to head straight to the station, and by the time officers drove back with me, it was nearly 4 in the morning and the intruder was gone. The prints, the glass, the blanket, all still there. But whoever it was had vanished into the woods. The next day, I replaced the window, patched up the cabin, and, most importantly, had a proper alarm system installed. But even then, fear kept me away. For 3 years, I couldn't bring myself to return. I packed my bags countless times and even made it all the way to the cabin. But the moment I stepped inside, the terror from that night came rushing back and I couldn't sleep. So I always ended up driving back home. I came close to selling it, but my conscience wouldn't let me list the place knowing what had happened. Finally, about 2 years ago, I went back. This time, I brought my girlfriend with me. And yes, she knew the whole story. But even so, she was willing to help me reclaim that cabin. Having someone else there made it easier. We stayed the weekend, and everything was perfectly normal. We started going up together a couple of times a year, and for a while, it felt like the nightmare had finally passed. I even started to feel like a coward, as if I'd blown the whole thing into more of a drama than it really was. Until last night. We were in bed when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the leaves outside, circling the cabin. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone trying the window latch. The same window from before, and every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't hesitate. I yelled at the top of my lungs that the police were already on their way. The noise stopped instantly, followed by a long silence. Even my girlfriend, who had woken up to my shout, knew exactly what to do. We didn't sleep after that, just sat up until the sky started to lighten. I don't know if they left because of my shouting, or if they're just biding their time. All I know is the forest doesn't feel like my refuge anymore. It feels like someone else's hunting ground. I still think about that night, even after more than 25 years. It's the kind of memory that grows and shrinks, but never really fades. Back then, I was 15, stuck in the same hollow of the Appalachians my family had been tied to for generations. Like roots too deep to pull out. Thatcher was 15 too. His family, another branch tangled into the same ridges. Our parents saw the mountains like you see the weather, always there, steady. The old folks, though, they treated those hills like a rule book. Every ridge and trail with its own warning. We grew up drowning in stories about those woods. The kind you laugh off as kids, but still carry in the back of your mind. Around here, nobody went out after dark. When we were little, it felt like some silly superstition old people clung to. But by the time we hit our teens, the laughter had turned into a dare we kept tossing back and forth, daring each other to push against it. We talked big about proving those stories were just made up. But deep down, we both knew they might not be. That's why we kept putting it off, waiting for the perfect night to finally test it. We were young and completely stupid. We lacked the maturity to understand that all those stories, no matter how ridiculous they sounded, always have a kernel of truth. Finding that truth is like a game. It can go very well and you walk away with one hell of a scare. Or it can go very badly and you lose your life. Another thing that made us postpone our midnight trips into the mountains was that our parents were always home and watching. We'd only recently earned a little more freedom, and if they caught us lying, if they found us out after dark, they'd lose it and stop trusting us. But finally, September came, and with it, the perfect opportunity. My parents had both taken vacation around that time, and they'd been talking about visiting my mom's sister for at least 2 years. They knew I couldn't go because of school, so they agreed to let me stay home. Thatcher was coming to spend those 2 days with me, and that made my parents feel more at ease. Little did they know, it was precisely when we were together that all the real trouble always happened. I'll admit that even then, we both hesitated a little before stepping out. We were scared shitless. It was one thing to fantasize about it, but a whole different reality to actually go through with the plan. In the end, we pushed each other, and a little after midnight, we finally left. We didn't want to risk a neighbor spotting us and running off to tell our parents. Plus, going out after midnight added another layer of fear. And at that point, all we really wanted was the rush of adrenaline. Each of us had our own bike, and even though we didn't know exactly where we were headed, we knew it took about 15 minutes of pedaling to reach a spot that was even remotely interesting. The first thing I noticed, something I already knew but wasn't truly prepared for, was just how dark the night really was. Even knowing it, neither of us was ready for the absolute blackness we faced. It felt like we were riding through a tunnel, and the farther we pedaled, the deeper we went into that darkness. We ended up stopping our bikes in a small clearing by the road. It wasn't likely that a car would come through there, but we still decided it was better to be cautious and hide them back in the trees. That's when we saw a car, tucked halfway into the woods. The sight of it terrified us, but at the same time the rush was so strong we could barely hold it in. Who the hell would be out there in the middle of the forest, and why? It was the perfect adventure for two dumb 15-year-olds. So, without thinking twice, we started walking through the trees, daring whoever might be out there. It was thrilling, fear mixed with curiosity. Every sound in the forest made us jump. A branch here, another over there. We knew they were normal noises. Both of us had been there during the day. But at night, everything was amplified. Every sound a potential threat. Still, we kept moving, hearts hammering, until we saw him. He was standing just a little deeper into the trees, partially hidden by shadows. He was turned away from us. And at that moment, any trace of a joke we might have had was gone. We were both obviously terrified and regretting putting ourselves in that situation. He held a shovel in his hand, striking something on the ground. We couldn't see what it was, because without wanting, I stepped on a dry branch that snapped loud. He stopped immediately and turned toward us. The fear that hit me then was unlike anything I'd ever felt. The man wore a white mask that covered his face, but even in the darkness, you could see it was smeared with some kind of grime. Before I even had a chance to warn Thatcher, I bolted. Thatcher screamed behind me and joined the run. We were both panicked, running blindly, knowing that whatever the man was doing was illegal, and he had seen us. We'd heard countless stories of criminals using the mountains as hideouts. We always thought they were just tales to scare kids off the woods, but that night proved they weren't. When we finally reached our bikes, I jumped on. But before I could start pedaling, something grabbed my arm and slammed me into the ground. It was him. Thatcher, horrified, jumped onto his bike and rode off. Honestly, I couldn't blame him. I would have done the same if I could. I thought he was going to kill me. Instead, he lifted the mask to his lips and said in that unmistakable voice that he knew where we lived, and if we told anyone what we had seen, he would destroy us. Then he just stood there, watching as I scrambled back onto the bike, my hands shaking, and pedaled like my life depended on it. Because it did. I've never pedaled so fast in my life, and when I finally reached home, Thatcher was sitting on the back steps, partially hidden, crying. When he saw me, his eyes widened, and all he could manage was a quiet apology. I nodded, and we hurried inside, locking every door and window before spending the rest of the night sitting on the living room floor, talking about what had happened. We never told anyone about that night. We were both terrified. Until now. Unfortunately, Thatcher died of cancer 2 years ago. And after his death, I found myself reflecting on so many things. I felt I needed to finally tell this story. I don't really know what to do with it. Whatever the man was doing that night had more than enough time to erase the evidence. And even though I recognized his voice that night, I still don't know who he was. Two weeks ago, something happened to me on the Pennsylvania section of the Appalachian Trail that I can't get out of my head. I had set out early in the day with the goal of reaching a set of waterfalls that I had read about, the kind that aren't marked on the maps and sit a couple of hours off the main trail. This time of year, the trail is pretty empty, but I've been there before when it's packed with hikers and families. The hike itself was fine, until out of nowhere I heard gunshots. At first I wasn't overly alarmed because the trail is usually busy and I figured it had to be someone being reckless, either hunting where they shouldn't or messing around with target practice. It bothered me, but I kept moving. The plan was to get to the falls before sunset and maybe camp there for the night. About an hour before it started getting dark, I reached them, and I was honestly thrilled by how beautiful and secluded they were. Hardly anyone seemed to know about them. Just as I was settling in, I heard the gunshots again. Only this time they were closer. That hit me differently because I had been off the trail for nearly 2 hours at that point. If the shots carried that far, it meant whoever was firing had also left the trail and was now somewhere deep in the woods near me. Guns had always made me uneasy, and now I couldn't shake the tension building in me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself people shoot in remote areas all the time. But later when I was making dinner, I thought I heard movement nearby. It sounded like someone walking not far from where I was camped, and that sent my nerves into overdrive. I forced myself to finish eating, but I couldn't relax. The idea of someone out there with a gun in such an isolated spot kept gnawing at me. When I had first explored the area, I noticed a shallow cave-like opening in the rock beside the falls. A kind of natural shelter. I had thought it would be a good place to duck into if it rained. But as night came on, I started to think it might be the safest place to sleep. I grabbed my pack and sleeping bag and moved into that little hollow. I was too wound up to fall asleep, so I sat there for a long time watching the water cascade in the moonlight. Even in the dark, the falls were stunning, and for a moment, I almost felt calm. Then I heard footsteps again. Someone was out there. From inside the cave, I could see my campsite, the tent, and my gear. My stomach dropped when I watched a man step out from the trees. He didn't hesitate, didn't try to move quietly. He just walked straight toward my tent. Then, he raised a gun, aimed, and fired into it. I had to press both hands over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. He didn't even check if anyone was inside. He just turned around and walked away, like it was nothing. I stayed frozen in that cave for what felt like forever, completely in shock, before I finally pulled out my phone and called the police. It took them nearly 4 hours to reach me, and only then did I leave the cave. I know an investigation is still ongoing, and I know part of that section of trail has been quietly closed, though nothing official has been said. 2 weeks later, I still haven't heard a single word about it. I know it hasn't been that long and the police are probably still piecing things together, but it makes me uneasy that nothing official has been communicated to the public. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into 3 truly terrifying stories that took place deep within the most remote and isolated parts of the Appalachian wilderness. From something caught on the security cameras of someone living completely off the grid, to a home invasion that still haunts its victim, and finally, an investigation that remains unsolved to this day. To me, these stories are as fascinating as they are disturbing. I don't know about you, but there's something about those lonely, far-off places that's beautiful and deeply unsettling. The untouched wilderness, the silence, it gets under your skin. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you started happening frequently and disturbingly not long ago. Maybe 2 weeks. Though I actually think it might have been going on for longer. I just didn't want to believe it. About 5 years ago, I hit a massive crisis. I'd always seen myself as the type of person who thrived on work. I held important positions, and working was my personality. I think everyone knows at least one friend like that. The one who can never do anything, or cancels at the last minute because of work. I look back at those days with sadness now, realizing I sacrificed everything in life for my job. But at the time, I didn't see it like that. On the contrary, I was proud of being the one always on top of deadlines, literally living to work. And then, out of nowhere, without warning and without a specific trigger I could identify, I stopped being able to keep up. I grew depressed. I started missing deadlines, sleeping in, having insomnia. I began isolating myself. Before, I didn't see my friends because I was working. Now I didn't see them because I didn't even have the strength to get off the couch. And when I say strength, I don't mean physical. When I finally went to the doctor, convinced I had some terrible disease, he told me it was burnout. I was shocked. In my personal dictionary, that word wasn't real. Certainly not for me. In my head, that happened to lazy people. People looking for excuses not to work. But I fell so low that I had to accept it was real and that I was going through it. Now that I've given you some context, maybe it's easier to understand why I reached what many of you might see as a dramatic, even radical conclusion. The only way to break this toxic relationship with work was to change my life completely. Another thing about me is that once I set my mind on a goal, I follow through without looking back. So when I decided to live as off the grid as possible, within a year, I was doing it. I'd always lived relatively close to the Appalachians, so when it came time to choose a new home, those mountains felt like the perfect place. After some research, I found a spot on Spruce Mountain that was perfect. Dirt cheap compared to what I paid in the city. I bought it without thinking twice, and within a year I was relatively adjusted. Sure, it's a massive shift, moving from the city to the middle of nowhere. But like I said, when I set a goal, I'm obsessed with it. I'll just give you some notions of the land. The house itself isn't huge. It has 2 floors, but even so, it's not big compared to the land around it. That, yes, is enormous, and in reality, it's completely isolated. It takes me at least 45 minutes by car to reach the nearest village, and if I go on foot, then it's more than a day's walk. But that's exactly what I wanted. I've been living here for about 5 years now, the last 3 of which were pretty peaceful. The best decision I've ever made. At least until about 6 months ago. More disturbingly, the last 2. Living isolated means I spend a lot of time on the outskirts of the house. I try to be as self-sufficient as possible. and I produce most of my own food. Obviously, I'm not a full-on hermit. I have a car, I go to town sometimes. But still, I spend very little time actually inside four walls. Nothing really strange had ever happened on my property. A few lunatics had passed by. But like I said, about 6 months ago I started noticing strange things. One night, I was sitting in the living room reading a book about monocultures, when I heard a knock at the window behind me. The window was closed, but the shutters were open. The only thing I could see outside was the darkness of the trees. I stayed still for a while, but nothing. So I ignored it and went back to my book. The next day, passing by that same window, I noticed finger marks on the shutter, like someone had been peeking inside, pressing both hands there. There was no doubt they were fingers, even if they were unnervingly long and thin, more than you'd expect from a normal person. But whatever. I thought maybe it was some unlucky wanderer, like the others I'd seen before, and ignored it. What made me uncomfortable was realizing I had been sitting with my back turned while someone was right there, mere inches away, watching me. A few days later, I was in the same spot, this time with the shutter closed, when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, followed by a whistle. I'm not even sure if it was a whistle. I just know it was a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I stayed alert for long minutes, listening, but there was nothing else. Just silence pressing in. I even considered the possibility that it had been something else entirely, or that I'd imagined it. But the way every hair on my body had stood on end told me my body had reacted, physically, instinctively. A few days later, I was in the kitchen heating up a late meal when I noticed movement among the trees. I looked closer and saw a shadow. I call it a shadow because I don't know what it was. I only know it stood on two legs and looked like a deformed man. I grabbed my shotgun and went to the front door, yelling what it wanted and warning that if it didn't leave, it would regret it. Days passed without anything else happening. Then one night, I was in bed upstairs when a stone struck my bedroom window. Not big enough to break it, just enough to get my attention. I peeked out and saw the same shadow among the trees again. Too dark to make out details, but I assumed it was someone trying to scare me. The thing that unnerved me the most was its head. It was distinctly lighter than the rest of its body, a stark shape against the darkness. I couldn't tell what it actually was, and the distance made it impossible to discern. I felt that instinctive fear again. My house is secure. I never leave anything open. Still, I went from room to room. Everything was locked. The house had been built to offer solid protection, but that was the first time I had a bad feeling, knowing I had a stalker who was either insane or had bad intentions. The next day, I did something I'd never needed to do before. I contacted several alarm companies, and that same night I installed 4 cameras around the perimeter, one for each cardinal direction. But nothing. The cameras picked up only small animals here and there. Until about 2 weeks ago, when they finally caught something. I'd mostly stopped checking them because I'd never seen anything. But that night, after taking out the trash, I felt almost certain something was watching me. I slammed the door, locked everything, and went upstairs to the computer streaming the live footage. For the longest time, nothing. Just the dark forest, which is terrifying in its own right. And then, Out of nowhere, movement. I went instantly on alert, and then I saw it. The camera quality isn't great, but you can clearly make out someone stepping out from the trees wearing a deer head as a mask. I was stunned. It's a horrifying sight, and I didn't even fully understand what I was looking at. But I decided, whatever it was, I'd do the same as I always had in life. Face it. I went downstairs, grabbed my shotgun, opened the door, and shouted at the top of my lungs that if I saw it again, I'd shoot. I spent the rest of the night on full alert, glued to the cameras. That image burned into my brain. The next day, I barely went outside, and whenever I did, I was armed. When night fell, my muscles locked up. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like threats would make it go away. I'd already threatened it before, and if I was right, this had been going on for months. I stayed staring at the camera footage for hours. There was nothing there except the forest, which, as I said, is terrifying. Then, after about 2 hours of complete darkness, he appeared. Standing in the exact same spot as the night before. I froze again, completely paralyzed by the image. It was real. I hadn't dreamed it. I tried taking a picture of the screen, but you can't make out anything clearly. When I finally managed to break free from that wave of panic, I went back downstairs, opened the door, scanned the trees with my gun. When I saw its shadow, I fired. It didn't move. It stood there, impassive and serene, staring exactly as it had before. I've always been good with guns. My father had many, and I grew up around them. I knew I hadn't missed. But how was that possible? Panicking, I shut the door and ran back to the cameras. And there it was, staring straight into the lens as if it knew the camera was there. Right now, I'm desperate. I don't know what to do. I don't understand what I'm facing. I don't know what it is. Every night it appears and spends the whole night staring into the camera. By morning, it's gone. I'm sleep deprived and seriously considering seeing a psychiatrist. Has anyone ever faced or even heard of something like this? I need answers before I lose my mind completely. All of this happened not long ago, and I have to admit, if there hadn't been other people with me, it would have seemed like some scene straight out of a movie. Unreal. Writing this now feels like an attempt to process what I went through, maybe even understand it. I've lived in West Virginia my whole life. When I finally had the money to buy a house, it never even crossed my mind to move to another state. Even though my work-from-home job gives me the flexibility to live anywhere, I always like the isolation. In fact, my goal was to find a place as secluded as possible. 2 of my friends knew I was looking for a house, and exactly what I wanted. So when one of them sent me an online listing, I instantly knew it was perfect for me. After 2 years of slowly making repairs, the place was finally ready for me to move in. It's completely cut off from everything, way more isolated than I'd initially imagined. When I'd go hiking, it felt like I was the only person left on Earth, and I loved that. The house itself was pretty big, with 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and more room than I ever really needed. The land around it is thick, full of dense trees, with an old trail running down the hillside that's no longer in use. My old place is about an hour and 50 minutes away by car, and that's the closest big area. There are a few other houses near mine, but they're completely isolated and still way too far to be considered neighbors. I can scream my head off out here and nobody would hear me. Or at least, no one was supposed to be close enough to hear me. Since I moved here, I've had friends visit, mostly when they want a little getaway or to experience what it's like to live completely off the grid. They live in towns or cities, and even though the forest surrounds them, it's still a distant experience. Out here in my cabin, I'm literally living in the middle of the woods. About a week ago, my cousin David came up with a friend of his, Cedric. David's the kind of guy who thinks he knows how to handle anything outdoors. He grew up camping and hunting with his dad, while I only started appreciating isolation later in life. I knew it was going to be a shock for him. Honestly, even for David. He's used to the woods, but not for more than a day at a time. The first day was amazing. We spent it unpacking, prepping food, stacking firewood by the door. It was late October, the days already shorter and the air cooler. Lighting the fireplace is a tradition. But as expected, after one day, David started getting restless and wanted to explore a trail before sunset. He left without a backpack or flashlight, saying he'd be back in half an hour. Cedric and I stayed inside the cabin. He was flipping through a book he'd brought. I don't know how much time passed before I realized it had gotten way too dark for David to still be out there. Not long after, Cedric came up to me asking the same thing. Shouldn't David be back by now? The sun had completely vanished behind the mountains, and the weak moonlight was the only light left. We waited a little longer. Like I said, David's experienced, and I was convinced he'd be back soon. But another hour passed in pitch blackness before I said I was going after him. Cedric started putting on his coat as if he was coming with me. I couldn't bring myself to say no, but honestly, I didn't want to head out into the night with someone totally inexperienced. I asked him to stay in case David showed up. He nodded. He understood it was important for someone to stay behind, and I felt relieved. I grabbed my flashlight, a small kit I always keep ready, and told Cedric I was going to check on David. I started down the trail slowly. At first, it was just that usual discomfort you feel being alone in the woods at night, especially in these forests, these mountains. Everything intensifies at night, and all those daytime legends you laugh at suddenly feel like real threats. Still, I wasn't walking scared. I was sure I'd find him quickly, probably with a small injury. I walked until, somehow, I knew I wasn't alone on the trail. I turned around more than once, expecting to see eyes glinting in the distance, but nothing. Still, I was sure I heard footsteps besides my own. I called out for David, told him we were worried, that this wasn't the time for jokes. We needed to get back to the house. Nothing. The forest was empty of sound. I pressed on, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. 5 minutes later, I saw David coming toward me. He wasn't running, but he was moving fast. His body tense, shoulders stiff, arms rigid. Even from a distance, I could see him glancing over his shoulder. When he saw me, I felt him relax just a little, but he clearly picked up his pace. I tried asking what was going on, but he only muttered that we needed to get out of there, back to the cabin. I didn't question it. I immediately knew something was wrong, and my earlier sense was probably right. So we hurried back to the cabin, and only once we'd locked the door did he tell me someone had been following him. A man standing between the trees, not saying a word, just staring and trailing him. Cedric was clearly shaken, and I, worried that the situation might spiral into something bigger than it was, told them not to worry. We'd lock all the doors and windows. It was probably just some guy pulling a prank, trying to scare off people walking near his property. Someone from one of the isolated cabins nearby, maybe. But he immediately corrected me, saying that this man definitely didn't live in one of those cabins. He looked like he actually lived out there in the woods. He was filthy and seemed like he was under the influence of something. After peeking out the windows and seeing nothing, we made dinner, played some games, and went to bed. I did my best to keep myself and Cedric calm, but nothing could get David to relax. A couple of days passed without incident. David finally started to relax, and so did I. I'd never had problems before. I didn't want to start now. One of the warmer nights, we lit a fire outside and sat talking. Cedric and I were calm, but David kept glancing at the forest every now and then. I realized maybe that scare had been a lot worse for him than I'd given him credit for. He was clearly still rattled. The next day, we decided to do the big hike David had wanted, but this time, he wouldn't be going alone. We climbed up to a nearby peak, took hours, and came back exhausted. At some point on the trail, that same uneasy feeling came back, the one I'd felt 3 days earlier when David had gone missing. But scanning the trees carefully, I didn't see anything. When we got back, David asked if he could shower first. He said he had a slight headache and maybe the shower would help. None of us minded, of course, so I stayed in the living room with Cedric. He was clearly exhausted. He wasn't used to that kind of physical exertion, so he wasn't saying much. At some point, I realized the sound of running water hadn't even started. A lot of time had passed. Even if David was doing something else in the bathroom, he would have told us if he'd be a while. That wasn't like him. I mentioned it to Cedric, but by now he was half asleep. Had I dozed off too? I looked at the clock. An hour and a half had gone by since we'd returned. I must have nodded off. David had probably already finished showering. I got up and went to the bedroom. I knocked and called for David, but there was no answer. My hand went to the doorknob. I could feel something was wrong. My heart was pounding without me even knowing why. I opened the door slowly. What I saw is something I'll never forget. David was kneeling in the corner, eyes wide, locked on me, shaking his head slightly as if telling me not to come in. Next to him stood a man, taller than me, so thin he looked sick. Long, black, greasy hair hung over his shoulders. But the worst part was his eyes, bulging, open too wide, an exhausted and empty stare fixed on David. I asked what the hell was going on, stepping toward them. Only halfway into the movement did I notice the man had something raised, a weapon. I looked at David. A thin line of blood was running down the side of his head. I asked again what was happening, and the man shouted that David had stolen his son. We were both stunned, not knowing what to say. Cedric must have heard the noise because the next thing I knew, he was at the doorway asking what was happening. That was enough to make the man glance at him, and in that split second I kicked at the hand holding the weapon. A shot rang out, and for a few seconds I couldn't tell if I, or anyone, had been hit. David reacted instantly, shoving the man to the ground. He wasn't yelling words, just high-pitched sounds, a mix between a scream and a growl. Everything was happening at once, At some point I felt a sharp pain in my arm. The man had just bitten me. By now, Cedric had grabbed the gun from the floor and was pointing it at the man, asking what the hell was going on, who he was. David said this was the guy who'd been following him during his hike. Now I understood why he'd been so scared. The man's appearance was bizarre. Looking at him was a mix of terror and pity. I asked him again what he wanted, but by now he was just whimpering. None of us knew what to do. Probably call for help. He didn't seem like a huge threat anymore. He looked more like someone utterly miserable. Then, Cedric said something that clearly set him off. He commented that the man looked like he'd come straight out of an asylum. At that word, the man went completely berserk. Lunged at Cedric, knocking him to the floor and slamming his head against the edge of the furniture. Then he bolted down the stairs and vanished. I tried to go after him, but he ran fast, and I wasn't about to throw myself into the woods at night again. It's been 4 months since then. I've never seen the man again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. David says he has no idea what the guy meant about his son. We don't even know how he got into the house while David was in the bathroom and we were sitting in the living room. All the doors and windows were locked. I still live here, but I'm always on edge, watching for when he might come back. What I'm about to tell you happened on October 21st, 2001, when I was on a 5-day hike in the Appalachians, more specifically near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The first 3 days were pretty interesting. The trail turned out to be more challenging than I had expected, and at one point I lost one of my backpacks. Don't ask me how it happened because I honestly have no idea. I just had it with me. And then, when I went to grab something from it later, it was gone. Given what happened afterward, I can't rule out the possibility that someone might have actually stolen it without me even noticing. Luckily, it wasn't a huge deal. The pack had some food, but I always brought extra. So, I still had more than enough for the next few days. It wasn't until the 4th day, around midday, that I came across something. At first, I only saw a blue tent in the distance, so my first thought was that I wasn't alone after all. There was someone else camping out there. To stay on my planned route, I had to pass right by the campsite. But obviously I wasn't just going to walk up and give someone a heart attack, or risk getting shot. So I tried calling out, saying hi, and explaining that I just wanted to pass through and keep going. But no one answered. I figured maybe they were out hiking or gathering firewood, so I thought I could safely go on my way. But as I got closer, I started noticing some details that really didn't add up. The first thing was that there was a sleeping bag, half inside and half outside the tent, with a bunch of stuff scattered around on the ground. The camp stove had been knocked over, and a little farther ahead, there was a blue sweatshirt covered in blood. That froze me right where I stood. Something had clearly gone down at that campsite. In a place that remote, your first thought is usually that it was an animal attack. But after looking closer, I saw the tent was full of food. Even the bag with the scattered stuff still had food in it. No animal would have just left that behind. At that point, I got really uneasy and realized I needed to turn back. So that's what I did. I wasn't afraid of walking through the forest at night. I'd done it countless times before. So I just started heading back. That's when, near a small creek, I came across a cell phone lying between 2 small rocks. I picked it up figuring it would probably be dead or locked with a pin. But back in the early 2000s, people didn't always use pins, and phone batteries lasted forever. This one still had some charge left. What I found on that phone chilled me to the bone. There were a bunch of photos, which I obviously can't show since they're in police custody. But they showed several different angles of the forest, and in all of them, you could see a man. In some pictures, the man was partially hidden among the trees. In others, he was more visible, but you could never clearly make out his face, partly because old phone cameras were terrible, and partly because many of the shots were blurry, like whoever was taking them was trying to document something while running away at the same time. What scared me the most about the whole sequence of photos was that the last one had been taken right there, exactly where I was standing. That completely shocked me. It was getting dark, and I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could. Thankfully, I made it out of that forest without anything happening. But the person who owned that phone was never found. To this day, they remain missing. Since I was directly involved in the investigation, I can't and won't reveal the person's name. Out of respect for the family, for the person themselves, and because the case still hasn't been officially closed. But it was horrifying to be out there in the middle of nowhere, realizing that something terribly wrong had just happened moments before, knowing that whoever did it might still have been somewhere in those woods, and that the person hadn't even been reported missing yet when I found that campsite. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into two disturbing stories that took place in the Appalachian Mountains. If you've been following the channel, you know most of our recent videos have focused on this region. But honestly, I can't get enough of it. There's something about the mystery that surrounds these mountains that just pulls you in. Today, we're looking at two cases that, in my opinion, are absolutely terrifying. The first story follows a group of friends who thought they were ready to take on the dangers of the mountains, only to realize they were completely unprepared for what was waiting for them. In the second story, we follow a man who finds himself at the center of a brutal crime. A crime that, to this day, remains unsolved. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. I haven't been able to reply to everyone, but I do read them all. Thanks for watching. Now, let's get into the video. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I'm 34 years old, and I've always been a guy with a deep passion for sports. Ever since I was a kid, I played on the school soccer team, and for years, I genuinely believed that was my future. I had talent, I knew that, and it wasn't just something I imagined. There were influential people in the field who showed interest in me, even exploring the possibility of a sports scholarship. But everything changed when I suffered a knee fracture. At the time, it felt like a devastating, nearly irreparable blow, because my entire identity had been built around soccer. I quite literally felt like nothing else in my life had meaning anymore, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. No matter how dedicated I was to physical therapy or how hard I tried to recover, I realized early on that I would never be the same again. For 2 years, I drifted through a state of apathy and deep depression, completely directionless, like I'd lost the compass that guided my life. That's when I met Alicia, a classmate from college who, without even knowing it, ended up giving my life some meaning again. We were never romantically involved, but we formed a deep bond, almost like siblings, a kind of rare and sincere connection. She was the one who introduced me to hiking. Luckily, my knee had healed enough to handle long walks, and little by little, I fell in love with the idea of exploring nature. At first, I always hiked in a group, usually with Alicia's friends, and later, I started going on solo hikes. Still, even though we got along well, I always felt like I didn't really have much in common with the group, and that became even more obvious when Alicia married one of my best friends, and the two of them moved to Illinois. Naturally, I grew distant from the group after that. I still went on a few hikes with Alicia and Mark whenever I visited them in Illinois. Or at least, I used to. Because after what happened, I'm no longer sure I want to set foot on a trail anytime soon. With the original group gone, I started feeling the need to find new companions, to build my own hiking circle. Making new friends after your 20s, at least for me, is a particularly difficult task. No matter how hard I tried, it always felt like the right people just weren't showing up. Then, in 2017, I joined a Facebook group for people who loved hiking, but, for one reason or another, felt more comfortable walking in groups. That decision completely changed my relationship with hiking and gave me a solid, meaningful network of friends. After going on several hikes across different regions of the US, I built friendships that I still hold on to today. The main group I hike with is made up of 4 of us. Jared, a former soldier who was discharged from the military due to an injury. Caleb, a New York City hairstylist who got tired of urban life and started a business supporting hikers. And Mateo, the most versatile of us all, always juggling multiple gigs and never tied down to a single job. Despite our differences, we share core values and a deep love for nature and adventure, which has led us, over the last 2 years, to plan several hiking trips all over the country together. I'm not the kind of person who says everything always goes smoothly or that hiking is some danger-free activity. Far from it. We've encountered some truly weird situations, disturbed people, even near robberies. One time, we woke up to find a stranger inside Mateo's tent. And since he's a notoriously heavy sleeper, he didn't even notice until morning. It was one of the scariest moments of our lives. But as those kinds of experiences happened, we kept learning, adapting our behavior and strategies to always be as prepared as possible. So when we decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail, we genuinely felt ready. Or at least we thought we were. It all started in early June of 2023. We got a later start than planned, so we only hiked for about 2 hours before deciding to find a good spot to set up camp. We came across a pretty nice clearing with ideal conditions. It wasn't directly on the trail, but it wasn't completely isolated either. We were close enough to the main path that, if something happened, other hikers could find us easily. We were finishing dinner and sitting around the campfire when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The initial reaction, as you'd expect, was shock. But we quickly realized he wasn't right. His speech was disjointed, his gaze empty and unfocused. And while he looked unkempt and dirty, he didn't seem like a homeless person living in the woods. On the contrary, he looked like someone who had taken care of himself, at least until recently, but had clearly been through something traumatic. We assumed he might be drunk, but there was no smell of alcohol. It was hard to explain. He wasn't threatening, didn't seem dangerous. There were 4 of us, and he was alone. More than anything, he looked like he needed help. We still had phone signal, so it didn't take long for us to call for assistance. That night, none of us got any real sleep. What disturbed us most was how, despite being confused, he kept obsessively repeating the same sentence. He was begging us, almost desperately, to make the whispers in his head stop. He said the whispers had started somewhere deep in the woods and had never left him since. At the time, we assumed it was some kind of mental illness. But later, we started to wonder if he wasn't actually crazy. Maybe he'd been driven to madness by something he'd seen or heard. I'd heard stories before. Folklore. Even unwritten rules tied to the Appalachians. Folktales about entities in the forest. Among those stories, the whispers came up again and again. Some say that in the more remote sections, the golden rule is to never respond to the whispers and to always stick together. I didn't pay much attention to those tales at the time, but that night changed everything. After the man was taken to the hospital, we tried to rest for a bit. And the next morning, we resumed the trail. Over the following 3 days, everything went as planned. The terrain was tough, and sometimes my knee would start to complain. But the pain was more than offset by the sense of inner peace that came with every step. It was like the worries of everyday life faded into the background, as if nature really did have the power to heal the mind. But on the fourth night, everything changed. We had eaten dinner and were already in our tents, when I was suddenly shaken awake by Caleb. I woke up groggy, taking a few seconds to understand what was going on, until a cold chill ran through me. The camp was surrounded by whispers. It felt like we were encircled by an invisible crowd, with faint, almost human voices murmuring non-stop. I asked him what was going on as I reached for the firearm I always carried on my hip. Caleb said he wasn't sure, but Jared wasn't in his tent. He had just vanished. The sound of the whispers had woken him, and when he checked Jared's tent, it was empty. We rushed out of ours and found Mateo already outside, on high alert, gun drawn and pointed at the trees. It was surreal. There were no figures to be seen, but the voices were unmistakable, a constant, low murmur. And we knew, almost instinctively, that we couldn't respond. That was one of the rules. You don't have to believe in folklore, but that night, it was the only logic we had. We had to follow the rules even without understanding them. And above all, we had to stay together. Still, we couldn't just abandon Jared. We set out to find him, never separating, moving as one. We found him sometime later, completely disoriented. The last thing he remembered was hearing a voice calling out to him, like something had compelled him to follow. He told me it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like he was under some kind of control. And coming from him, a man with military training and razor-sharp survival instincts, that scared the hell out of me. The return was unbelievably difficult, for reasons I still can't explain. What should have been a simple 30-minute trek felt like an endless journey. We kept passing the same spots, as if walking in circles, even though we were absolutely sure we weren't. Jared, though back with us, kept asking nonsense questions, forgetting what was going on. Sometimes he seemed himself again, but quickly drifted back into a kind of mental fog. By the time dawn broke, we were desperate, and that's when we spotted another campsite. We knew immediately it wasn't ours, and approaching it had to be done carefully. But thankfully, the people there were kind and welcoming. After we shared our story, they offered help. The most terrifying part, though, was discovering we were almost 200 miles from our original camp. It was physically impossible for us to have covered that distance overnight. And even if it were possible, how do you explain the fact that we spent hours feeling like we were stuck in the same spot? We called for professional assistance, and a team was sent to the location where we had camped. Everything was untouched, like nothing had ever happened. If we had made it back to our camp on our own, maybe we would have convinced ourselves it was all just a collective episode. Something we ate, something in the air, who knows? But the fact that we did something impossible makes it all too real, too unsettling, and it keeps me asking, more and more often, what really lives in those mountains? What was it we heard that night, and why? I don't have answers, but I know that night unlocked a new kind of fear in us. We'd faced dangerous people before, but never the unknown. And lately, I keep thinking about trying to track down the man we helped that first night, trying to find out what he saw, trying to understand what we still can't. What I'm about to tell you happened just 2 weeks ago, and even though I've been through plenty of bad things in my life, I never imagined this experience would turn out to be one of the scariest and most haunting moments I've ever lived through. I had anything but a happy childhood, and to be honest, there was never really room for any real sense of happiness. I grew up in a house where violence was a daily thing, with a father who was brutal, unpredictable, and consumed by a kind of rage that seemed endless. And a mother who, even though her heart was in the right place and she did everything she could, was never really able to stand up to his outbursts. She ended up living constantly caught between fear and despair. Still, the only times my mom ever seemed to find this almost superhuman inner strength was when he threatened to take his anger out on me. Those were the moments she stepped in, even if it cost her. And for that, no matter what, I'll always be grateful to her. That said, my childhood was miserable, filled with constant instability and an almost total lack of affection or safety, which of course took a toll not just on my self-esteem but also on my performance in school. It felt like I was born already carrying an invisible sentence that said I'd never amount to anything good or meaningful in life. When I was 17, my mom passed away. And that loss, besides being absolutely devastating, also became a kind of forced awakening. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose, or maybe because I finally realized I couldn't stay in that environment anymore. So as soon as I turned 18, I built up the courage, stood up to my father, and left that house behind. He could deal with his rage on his own, because even if he gave me his genes, he was never truly my father. Leaving wasn't just a step forward. It was a kind of indescribable relief. It's been 12 years since then, and even though there are still moments when the past feels like an anchor dragging me down, I can honestly say I know who I am now. And little by little, I've been rebuilding what was broken inside me. It's not an easy process, as you can imagine. And sometimes there are setbacks, days when everything feels like it's falling apart again. But in those moments, I think about my mom, about that image of her putting herself between me and my father's fists, and that memory helps me push through the darkest times. So now that that's out of the way, it's important to explain that I never had many opportunities. And when I left home, I ended up living on the streets, which, ironic as it sounds, wasn't even the lowest point of my life. I was lucky enough to cross paths with a volunteer who believed in me for no apparent reason, and who, with incredible generosity, helped me regain my strength, find some direction, and even gave me an old van that, while in desperate need of repairs, gave me a real shot at starting over. A small space that protected me from the cold, the rain. Since then, I've managed to build a more stable life. I found work, and even though the van's not new, with all the repairs I've done over the years, it's become almost an extension of me. Sure, I could afford a new one now, but this van means something deeper than just transportation or a house. It represents hope. It marks the moment a complete stranger took a chance on me, without knowing a thing about me. It reminds me there are still good people out there. Whenever I can take some time off, I like to travel through the mountains. It feels like my safe space, a refuge where I can breathe and be alone with myself. So 2 weeks ago, when I managed to get 14 days off, I decided it was finally time to explore a part of the Appalachian Mountains. I don't even live that far, but I'd never had the chance before, and the thought of wandering through those remote, majestic landscapes genuinely excited me. Traveling through the mountains in an old van isn't easy, but I'm used to it. I know the sounds the van makes, I know its limits, and I was confident everything would go smoothly. The first few days were peaceful, though a few strange things happened. One night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound coming from the mountains that felt off. I can't even describe it properly. It was somewhere between a distant wail and a muffled metallic noise. I ended up brushing it off and going back to sleep, convincing myself it was just an animal. But everything changed on the third night. I was in West Virginia, one of the spots I'd most wanted to visit. So when I found a good place to park the van, a dirt back road near a small creek, I didn't hesitate. The plan was to stay 2 or 3 nights and maybe do a few short hikes. But things started going wrong that very first night. I had just finished dinner and was already lying inside the van, everything cleaned up, watching YouTube videos on my phone, when I heard a car pass by. It caught my attention because, along with the sound of the engine, there was this strange, constant whistling noise, like a mechanical issue. Maybe the exhaust or the brakes. What really got to me, though, was how slowly the car was moving. That's unusual in an area like that, where the few people who drive around usually just speed through, since there's no traffic or people, just the occasional animal crossing the road. I ignored the sound and went back to my video, but less than 2 minutes later, I heard the same car again. This time clearly turning onto the dirt road where I was parked. That's when I started to feel a bit uneasy. In urban areas, it's normal to share space with other vans or cars, but out in the woods, where there are so many other places to stop, it's more than a little suspicious for someone to choose the exact same spot. I considered that maybe the person didn't see me parked there, or maybe felt safer near someone else. But honestly, that felt like a lame excuse to avoid facing the growing discomfort I was feeling. Even with the curtains shut, the headlights lit up parts of the van's interior. I waited for them to turn off the engine and lights, but nothing happened. I stayed completely still and quiet as the minutes dragged on. Finally, the headlights went out. I heard one door open and close. Then footsteps. Then another door, and more footsteps. That's when I realized there was more than one person, and they were getting closer to the van. Panic started to creep in. I've had people mess with the van or try the doors before, but always in the city, never somewhere this isolated. One of them turned on a flashlight and tried to look inside, and in that moment, I thought about yelling, about threatening that I had a weapon. But the truth is, I had nothing. And I'd heard too many stories from other people who live in vans saying the best move is to pretend nobody's inside. Then I heard something that froze my blood and made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. A sharp pop, a bang, and I realized they were slashing the van's tires. Whatever chance I had of escaping was gone in that instant, and if I still had any doubts about their intentions, those doubts vanished. They were there to hurt someone, and now they knew I couldn't start the van. That's when I heard another vehicle approaching from the distance. The distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel, and in that moment, my fear turned into pure instinct. I heard the men move away from the van, apparently going to meet the new vehicle. I got up, grabbed the knife I always carry with me, and slid into the driver's seat. I opened the door as quietly as possible and stepped out. I was in a position where I couldn't see them, and hopefully, they couldn't see me either. I jumped down a rock ledge and made my way to the creek, hiding in the thick brush. I was almost sure they'd heard me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. And even with the noise of the car and the voices, I felt completely exposed. I crawled away as quietly as I could, but I kept the van in sight. The second car stopped and at least 2 more men got out. 4 total. I watched them move toward the van. Two had baseball bats, one had a knife, and the other held something I couldn't identify. They circled the van, which confirmed they still thought I was inside. A small relief. But it also meant that sooner or later, they'd figure out I wasn't, and might start looking for tracks or searching the area. I kept moving, trying to stay quiet, but not losing pace. When I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, I started running. I ran like I never had before. I stopped only long enough to catch my breath and kept going. I don't know how many hours passed in that cycle of panic, escape, and exhaustion. I know I spent the whole night out there. The sun was already up, and I still had no idea where I was. Just a knife in my hand, and my phone left behind in the van. I was thirstier than I'd ever been. Extreme stress completely dries out your mouth. It wasn't until around 11 in the morning that I heard a car in the distance and realized I must be near a road. I stayed hidden, afraid those men might still be out looking for me. Or someone else. It was only when I heard the distinct sound of a truck that I finally worked up the courage to step out of the bushes and ask for help. The trucker was surprisingly understanding and told me that something almost identical had happened in that same area about 15 years ago, and that shook me to my core. 15 years? Were these the same people? Or were there other groups out there doing the same kind of twisted thing and getting away with it? The police confirmed that there had been several similar incidents reported in that region over the years. They took me back to the spot where I'd left the van, and the sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. It was completely trashed, vandalized inside and out, totally unrecognizable. Since then, I've been staying at a coworker's place. And honestly, I think my days of living in a van are over. Maybe it's time to rent a place of my own, to accept that, as much as that life once saved me, it's not safe anymore. And maybe it never really was.